I'm not good, Morty.
Let's talk about the one character in Rick and Morty who actually won. Not won in a small way. Not won like he got the last slice of pizza or figured out the right answer before Rick did. I mean won in the way that matters in this universe. He looked at an infinite multiverse carefully designed to keep people like him small, figured out exactly what was happening, and then burned the whole thing down on his way out the door. I'm talking about Evil Morty. And honestly, even calling him Evil Morty feels reductive now. That's the name fandom gave him, a placeholder label that the show eventually leaned into, almost sardonically, because the show is aware of itself like that. But when you actually sit with what this character does, what he understands, and what his arc ends up meaning in the context of the entire series, the word evil starts to feel like exactly the wrong lens to look at him through. Because here's the thing, the show never really frames him as a villain in the traditional sense. There's no mustache twirling, there's no speech about world domination, there's no moment where he breaks down his plan to destroy everything just for the sake of chaos. Every single time Evil Morty appears on screen, and it's not that many times, which makes each appearance feel enormous, he's doing something specific, deliberate, and traceable back to a coherent worldview. He has a logic, and that logic, once you understand it, is actually kind of terrifying. Not because it's wrong, but because it might be right. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about why Evil Morty stands out not just from other antagonists in the show, but from every single other Morty we've ever seen. The first time most fans realized something was deeply unusual about Evil Morty was Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. This is the episode where Rick C-137 gets framed for the murder of other Ricks across the multiverse. The interdimensional council of Ricks drags him in, accuses him, and when he escapes with Morty to try and clear his name, we end up in the dark underbelly of something the show was only beginning to reveal: the existence of Ricks and Mortys as a class system, as an institution, as a structure of power. In this episode, the actual killer is eventually revealed to be another Rick One, who appears to have a patched eye, looks disheveled, and seems to be operating outside the usual Rick hierarchy. But the twist, the real twist, the one that lands like a dropped brick, is that this rogue Rick isn't the one calling the shots at all. He's being controlled. And who's controlling him? His Morty. The Morty has a device wired directly into this Rick's brain, and he's been pulling the strings the entire time. Not because someone told him to, not because another Rick set it up, because he figured out how to do it himself and chose to. And then he's captured. And then this is the moment he smiles. It's one of the most quietly chilling moments in the entire series. Everyone else in that situation would be panicking or crying or trying to bargain. This Morty sits in his cell, looks at the camera, and gives this small, knowing smile, like he's not done, like getting caught was either part of the plan or simply an acceptable setback, like he already knows something we don't. And honestly, that smile is the whole character right there. That single expression communicates something that takes the rest of the series multiple seasons to fully unpack. This is a Morty who is not afraid of Ricks. Think about how radical that is. Really sit with it for a second. Every Morty we see in this show, literally every single one, orbits around a Rick. That's the gravitational arrangement of their universe. Ricks are brilliant, terrifying, capable of anything. Mortys are sweet, well-meaning, emotionally present, and fundamentally in over their heads. The relationship dynamic is baked into the premise of the show. It's in the title. Rick and Morty. Rick first, always. Even in the Citadel, this massive society of Ricks and Mortys, the Ricks run everything, and the Mortys are, to put it generously, subordinate. And yet, here is this one Morty who had a Rick on a leash, literally, neurologically. He was using his Rick as a tool, as a means to an end. He had inverted the entire natural order of their relationship, and, more than that, he had turned it into a weapon against the Citadel's structure itself. That's not something a normal Morty does. That's not even something most Ricks would think to do. That's the action of someone who has stared at the system for a long time, understood it completely, and then decided to attack it at its foundations. Now, when you first watch close Rick counters of the Rick kind, you might just think, okay, Evil Morty villain, got it. That's a fun twist. And the show moves on. It doesn't linger. Rick and Morty doesn't do a lot of lingering. The episode ends, and for a long time, that character, that Morty with the smile in the cell, just stays there, waiting. The show doesn't revisit him for 2 full seasons, and that's actually meaningful, because during those 2 seasons, we're learning more about how this world works. We're learning about the Citadel. We're learning about how Mortys are treated, what they're for, how expendable they are. We're seeing the psychological toll that traveling with Rick takes on a Morty. We're seeing how the relationship between a Rick and a Morty warps both of them over time. And all of that context is accumulating quietly, like water rising in a room, so that when Evil Morty comes back in Season 3, Episode 7, and we watch him run for president of the Citadel and win, everything he does and says lands with this enormous weight that it wouldn't have had without all those earlier episodes. But let's stay in Season 1 for just a moment longer, because there's something about his first appearance that I want to linger on specifically. When Rick C-137 and Morty are running from the Council of Ricks, they end up in a location that the show describes as a sort of Morty farm. It's a warehouse full of Mortys, stacked up in rows, all of them connected to devices, all of them experiencing simulated pleasant realities, while their brain activity, their Morty waves, is harvested to mask the brain waves of Rick's. Because in this universe, the specific neural frequency of a Morty's brainwave is what makes a Rick invisible to detection. The anxiety and simple emotions of a Morty essentially cancel out the genius frequency of a Rick's mind. This is horrifying on about 6 different levels, and we'll get into all of them later. But for right now, what I want you to notice is Evil Morty knows about this. He knows exactly what Mortys are for in the grand cosmic sense. He knows they're used as camouflage. He knows they're essentially living suppression devices. And not only does he know this, he uses it. He reverse engineers it. He takes the fact that Mortys are tools and turns it into a tool of his own. There's a kind of horrible intelligence to that. The average Morty, if they found out what they were being used for, would probably break down, would probably feel betrayed, violated, horrified. Evil Morty's response to the same information appears to have been something more like, interesting, how can I use that? And this is what makes Evil Morty so singular as a character. He's not just a smart Morty. He's a Morty who has internalized Rick's mode of thinking, the cold, analytical, weaponized intelligence, but has aimed it in a completely different direction. Rick uses his intellect to navigate the universe, to survive it, to occasionally understand it and hold it at arm's length with ironic detachment. Evil Morty uses his intellect to dismantle the universe that was built to contain him. Now, you might be wondering at this point, where does a Morty get that from? How does any Morty end up thinking this way? That's exactly what this whole theory is about, because the answer isn't he was born evil or some random mutation made him smart. The answer, when you trace the logic of the show carefully, points back to something that Rick himself built, enabled, and set in motion. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's keep building the foundation first. What sets Evil Morty apart isn't just his intelligence, though that's obviously a major part of it. It's also his self-awareness. Normal Mortys don't really think about their place in the universe. They're not equipped to. They're in survival mode most of the time, just trying to keep up with whatever Rick is doing, just trying to not die on this week's adventure. They don't have the bandwidth to zoom out and examine the structure of reality because reality keeps exploding around them, and they have to deal with that first. Evil Morty, by contrast, has clearly done an enormous amount of zooming out. He's looked at the big picture. He's examined the Citadel, the Rick and Morty relationship dynamic, the multiverse, the whole architecture, and he's reached a set of conclusions that are both logically rigorous and absolutely devastating. He understands what Mortys are. He understands what Ricks are. He understands what the Citadel is for. And he understands that the whole thing is a trap. This is why, when he speaks, and he doesn't speak often, what he says carries so much weight. His words are economical in the way that only really confident people's words are economical. He doesn't explain himself to people he doesn't think deserve the explanation. He doesn't monologue. He doesn't perform. He just acts, and occasionally says exactly what he means with no flourish and no apology. Compare that to Rick C137 who never stops performing. Rick is constantly talking, constantly deflecting, constantly wrapping himself in sarcasm and nihilism and pop culture references. It's armor. Obviously, the show makes that clear over time. Rick talks so much partly because he's so afraid of the silence inside himself. Evil Morty is almost entirely silent, and there's nothing afraid in that silence. There's something closer to clarity. And that contrast is important because these two characters, Rick C137 and Evil Morty, are in some ways mirrors of each other. Both of them have seen through the performance of the universe. Both of them understand that the rules most people live by are constructs. Both of them are operating at a level of meta-awareness that most people, Rick, Morty, or otherwise, never reach. The difference is what they do with that awareness. Rick responds to cosmic meaninglessness with nihilistic detachment and private, buried grief. Evil Morty responds to systemic oppression with focused, patient, surgical revolution. And here's what makes this theory interesting and worth spending 40,000 words on. The evidence suggests that you can't really have Evil Morty without Rick. Not because Rick made Evil Morty in some literal, explicit, sci-fi origin story sense, but because Rick built the world that produced him. Rick built or reinforced the system that created the conditions that would eventually generate a Morty so psychologically warped by that system that he decided to tear the whole thing apart. Evil Morty isn't just a character, he's a consequence. Now, to understand that consequence, we need to understand the machine that produced him, and the machine is the Citadel. But before we get there, before we get into the infrastructure and the politics and the cold mechanics of how the Citadel works, I want to spend a little more time on Evil Morty's first appearance, because there are some details in that episode that don't fully register until you've seen everything that comes after. When the rogue Rick, the one being controlled by Evil Morty, is murdering other Ricks across the multiverse, there's a specificity to who gets killed. These aren't random Ricks, they're council-adjacent Ricks, institutional Ricks, Ricks who represent and enforce the Citadel's power structure. The killings aren't chaotic, they're targeted. This is already someone with a plan, not someone acting out of simple rage or madness. Then there's the Morty farm. Evil Morty orchestrates the discovery of the Morty farm, partly as a way to expose Rick C137 to make it look like C137 is the one running the farm, harvesting Mortys for their brain waves. This is a multi-layered manipulation. He's using one system of Morty exploitation, the brainwave harvesting farm, to frame a specific Rick, one who notably is unusual for caring about his Morty, and discredit him within the very council that enforces that system. He's weaponizing the council's own logic against one of the few Ricks who might be capable of seeing through it. Whether that means Evil Morty already had a specific grudge against Rick C137 at this stage, or whether C137 was simply a convenient target, is genuinely ambiguous, and the show keeps it ambiguous on purpose. But the sophistication of the plan, the nested layers of it, tells you everything about the kind of mind you're dealing with. And then he's caught, and he smiles. I keep coming back to that smile because I think it's the key to everything. It's not a smile of defeat. It's not even a smile of acceptance. It's a smile that says, I know something you don't, and I'll still be thinking when you're not watching. Every subsequent appearance of Evil Morty, his quiet ascent through Citadel politics in Season 3, his methodical dismantling of the entire institution in Season 5, feels like the continuation of whatever he was thinking in that cell, like he spent his imprisonment planning, refining, understanding, like being caught was just a chapter, not an ending. That's not how Mortys think. That's not how most people think. That's something that had to be developed, cultivated, built through experience, through suffering, through exposure to a particular kind of intelligence operating at a particular frequency. And when you think about it, when you really trace it back, the only real crucible that could produce that kind of thinking in a Morty is time spent with a Rick. Not just any Rick. Specifically, the kind of Rick who would push a Morty to their absolute limits again and again, exposing them to the worst the universe has to offer, never letting them rest in comfortable ignorance, forcing them to engage with reality as it actually is, rather than as they'd like it to be. The kind of Rick who would, whether intentionally or not, forge something in that Morty that the Morty's factory factory settings never would have produced. Which brings us back to the central question of this whole video. Did Rick create Evil Morty? Not in the obvious sense. Rick didn't build Evil Morty in a lab. He didn't sit down one afternoon and decide, today I'm going to manufacture a revolutionary. The theory isn't that clean, and honestly it's more interesting for not being that clean. The theory is that the system Rick built, the relationship dynamic he established, the world he constructed, the way he treats Mortys, is exactly the kind of pressure that would, under the right circumstances, produce exactly this result. That Evil Morty is what happens when you take the Morty template, apply maximum Rickian pressure to it for long enough, and get a Morty who doesn't break but instead understands. Think of it like this. Rick is the smartest man in any universe he inhabits. He's created weapons, collapsed governments, bent the laws of physics like they owe him money. He has done all of this for decades, maybe centuries, and in all that time, the one constant companion he's chosen or been fated to carry with him is a Morty. Why? That's actually one of the most interesting questions the show raises and never fully answers. Officially, the explanation is the brainwave camouflage thing. Morty's simple, anxious mind masks Rick's genius frequency from detection. But that's a utilitarian explanation for a relationship that clearly runs much deeper than utility on both sides. Rick isn't just using Morty as a signal jammer. He's using Morty as something else, as an anchor, as a conscience maybe, or as a reminder of someone he lost. And that relationship, however broken and asymmetrical it is the most important relationship in Rick's life. Now, what if that relationship, that specific dynamic, with all its toxicity and affection and manipulation and genuine care, is also the exact thing that can produce a Morty capable of becoming Evil Morty? What if Rick's greatest weakness and Rick's greatest creation are the same thing? That's the theory, and we're going to build the case for it, piece by piece, section by section, over the rest of this video. We're going to look at the Citadel and how it works. We're going to look at the way Mortys are treated, not just by the system in the abstract, but in specific scenes with specific consequences. We're going to trace the psychological journey that spending time with Rick does to a Morty's mind. We're going to analyze Evil Morty's intelligence, his hatred, his worldview, and his endgame. We're going to look at the Central Finite Curve, what it is, who built it, and why Evil Morty's rejection of it is the most politically radical act in the entire series. We're going to watch him dismantle the Citadel piece by piece and understand why every single move he makes is traceable back to something Rick built. And then, at the end, we're going to sit with the uncomfortable conclusion that the show itself seems to be pointing toward, even if it never says it outright, that the most dangerous thing in Rick's universe isn't a galactic federation, or a Cremulian, or a Rick who went mad. It's a Morty who woke up. And the really uncomfortable thing, is that you can draw a direct line from Rick's actions to that awakening. You can draw a direct line from Rick to Evil Morty. So, let's start drawing it. Let's start with the Citadel, Section 2, the Citadel system. Okay, so before we can talk about Evil Morty as a revolutionary, we have to talk about what he's revolting against. Because the Citadel isn't just a setting in this theory, it's the whole argument. It's Exhibit A, B, and C simultaneously. It's the clearest possible expression of what the universe looks like when Ricks are in charge of designing it. And when you really look at it, not just as a fun sci-fi background detail, but as a functioning society with its own logic and economy and class structure, the Citadel is one of the most quietly horrifying things in the entire show. Let's establish the basics first. The Citadel of Ricks is introduced in Season 1, Episode 10, during that same episode where we first meet Evil Morty. At its most surface-level description, it's a massive space station, or more accurately, a massive constructed habitat that sits at an interdimensional nexus point, accessible to Ricks from across the multiverse via portal gun. It serves as a kind of United Nations/city for alternate dimension Ricks and their Mortys. In theory, it's a sanctuary, a place where Ricks who've gotten in trouble in their home dimensions can find safety, community, mutual aid, a place where no single government from any one dimension has jurisdiction. In practice, it's a feudal state with a technocratic aristocracy and a permanent underclass. The Ricks run everything, every institution, every authority, every economic structure. They're the cops, the politicians, the scientists, scientists, the judges. The Citadel is essentially a Rick meritocracy, or at least it presents itself that way. In reality, it functions more like an oligarchy, where the ruling class uses the language of merit to justify their monopoly on power, and the Mortys, the tens of thousands, maybe millions of Mortys who live on the Citadel, are not really citizens in any meaningful sense. They're workers, they're support staff, they're the infrastructure that Ricks need to maintain their invisibility to outside forces, but don't particularly want to acknowledge as equals. This is where we first encounter the specific cruelty that defines the Citadel's relationship to its Morty population, a cruelty that isn't hot and dramatic, but cold and structural. It's not that individual Ricks are running around beating up Mortys for fun. It's that the system is built so that Mortys can never accumulate enough power, money, respect, or institutional access to challenge Rick dominance. The exploitation isn't personal, it's procedural. And procedural exploitation is the most durable kind, because it doesn't require anyone to be consciously evil. It just requires everyone to keep doing their jobs. Season 3, Episode 7, The Ricklantis Mix-Up, also known as Tales from the Citadel, is one of the most remarkable episodes of television in the entire run of the show. And it's remarkable specifically because of how thoroughly it constructs and examines this society. While Rick and Morty are off on a completely separate adventure, one we never even see since the episode's story keeps cutting away from it to maintain the joke that this supposedly side episode is actually the main event. The entire runtime is devoted to life inside the Citadel, and what we see is not a functional society. What we see is a society in the late stages of ideological rot, propped up by institutional inertia and the passive compliance of its most disadvantaged members. Let's walk through what the episode actually shows us, because every single storyline in it adds something essential to the picture. First, there's the story of two Morty cops, one who is a rule follower who believes in the system, and one who is a cynical Morty who has been on the street long enough to know exactly how corrupt everything is. This is the show doing its version of a police procedural, but filtered through the specific horror of a society where Mortys are explicitly second class. The cynical cop, who goes by Cop Morty, effectively has clearly been absorbing the lessons of life in the Citadel for a long time. He knows that the Ricks in power are dirty. He knows that justice is not applied equally. He knows that Mortys who step out of line disappear, and he's adjusted to this reality by becoming morally flexible in ways that his more idealistic partner hasn't yet. When you watch this story, what strikes you is how completely this Morty has absorbed the Citadel's values, its cold pragmatism, its understanding that power is the only currency that actually matters, and is trying to use those values to survive within the system. He's not trying to change the system, he's trying to navigate it. And navigation in a system this corrupt requires a certain amount of collaboration with the corruption. Then there's the story of Simple Rick's wafer cookies, a Rick who is working a factory job, which is to say, a Rick who has been demoted to the most humiliating position imaginable for a Rick, since Ricks are supposed to be the intellectual aristocracy of the multiverse. This Rick got stuck. He had a moment of genuine human happiness sitting with his daughter, watching the sunlight, and he got so lost in that feeling that he stopped being Rick-like. He stopped innovating, stopped dominating, stopped performing genius. And the Citadel's response was to not just fire him, but to monetize his moment of happiness. They hook him up to a machine, harvest the neurochemical signature of that one pure memory of his daughter, and use it to flavor their snack cookies. His joy becomes a product. His most human moment becomes factory output. This storyline is devastating on its face, the way the show wrings genuine pathos from what sounds like an absurdist premise, but it's also politically precise. It shows you what happens to beings in the Citadel who fail to remain useful in the expected way. You don't get compassion. You don't get a second chance. You get repurposed. You become a resource. Because in the Citadel, every being is ultimately understood as a resource to be deployed or discarded. Then there's the story of a Rick presidential candidate, the establishment Rick, a groomed and polished and perfectly respectable Rick who represents the Citadel's existing power structure, running against a populist Morty who's gotten onto the ballot somehow. To everyone's shock and mild horror. This is obviously the thread that matters most for our purposes, because this is where Evil Morty enters Season 3. But let's look at the presidential race itself first, and what it tells us about the Citadel's politics before we get to Evil Morty's role in it. The establishment Rick candidate is everything you'd expect: articulate, confident, wielding institutional authority, promising stability and continuation of the Citadel's existing policies. He talks about safety, about Citadel exceptionalism, about the need to maintain the order that has made the Citadel what it is. In other words, he's defending the status quo, and the status quo works very well for the Ricks, who've benefited from it, and not at all for the Mortys, who've been ground up by it. The Morty candidate, and we're not supposed to initially realize this is Evil Morty, which is the episode's central sleight of hand, runs as a populist. He speaks about inequality. He speaks about Morty oppression. He speaks in the language of the disadvantaged. He says the things that the Citadel's Morty underclass has always wanted to hear from someone in power, and it works. He wins by a landslide, because of course the millions of Mortys who live as second-class citizens in this supposedly shared society would vote for the candidate who finally seems to be speaking their language. This is the show at its most politically literate. It's not subtle about the allegory, the underclass voting for a populist who claims to speak for them, not fully understanding what that populist's actual agenda is, but it's also not mean-spirited about it. The Mortys who vote for this candidate aren't stupid. They're desperate. They've been squeezed for so long that anyone who seems to offer relief is going to get their vote. The tragedy isn't that they were fooled. The tragedy is that a system of genuine equality was never on offer. Because the twist, and this is the twist that lands differently every time you think about it, is that the Morty candidate is Evil Morty. And once elected, he doesn't pursue Morty liberation. He pursues power. He has all of his advisors, Ricks, who might threaten his position, executed. He has dissidents removed. He uses the Citadel's own mechanisms of control to consolidate his authority. And then he sits in the president's chair and gives that same smile, the one from the cell in Season 1, to the camera. Now, what does this tell us? A few things, and they're all important. First, Evil Morty is not a Morty liberationist in any simple sense. He's not doing this for the Mortys. He's using the Mortys, their genuine grievances, their desperate hope, as a vehicle for his own ends, which is, by the way, exactly what the Ricks have always done. He's beaten the Ricks at their own game by becoming more ruthless than they are. Second, the political system of the Citadel is not actually capable of producing genuine reform. It's designed to absorb potential challengers and turn them into servants of the existing order. Except in this case, the challenger is operating at a level of sophistication that the existing order didn't anticipate. Third, and this is the one that matters most for our theory, the Citadel's fundamental problem is not that the wrong people are running it. The problem is what it is. It doesn't matter whether a Rick or a Morty sits in the president's chair, because the institution itself is built on exploitation. The question Evil Morty is eventually going to answer in Season 5, Episode 10 is not how do you fix the Citadel, but do you fix it or do you destroy it? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the Citadel's structure for now, because to understand why the Citadel is the way it is, you have to understand the specific theory that underlies it. And the theory, the political philosophy of the Citadel, if you want to call it that, goes something like this. Ricks are the smartest beings in any universe. Mortys are essential to Rick's survival and functionality. Therefore, a society in which Ricks are dominant and Mortys are subordinate is the natural order of things, not an injustice to be corrected. It's not oppression, it's just the way reality works, and everyone who lives in reality should make their peace with it. This is, of course, the argument that every ruling class makes in every era. We're on top because we're better. We're better because we're on top. The logic is circular, but circular logic is remarkably durable when the people making it also have all the weapons and all the institutions. What makes the Citadel's version of this argument particularly pernicious is that it has actual empirical content. Ricks genuinely are extraordinarily intelligent. The gap in cognitive capability between a Rick and an average being, including most Mortys, is real and enormous. So the Citadel can point to this as natural justification for its hierarchy. It's not prejudice. It's just physics. It's just the distribution of intelligence across the multiverse. Some people have it, some people don't, and the ones who do should be in charge. But here's where the argument falls apart, and where the show is being genuinely clever. Intelligence is not the same as wisdom. Capability is not the same as virtue. Being able to do more does not mean you have the right to do more to others. And the Citadel, for all its claims to intellectual superiority, has constructed a society that is brutal, extractive, and ultimately self-defeating because it has taken the one group of beings who might actually understand and empathize with the Morty experience, Mortys themselves obviously, but also Ricks who've been beaten down by the system and systematically crushed their capacity to do anything about it. The Citadel is smart in the way that only Ricks could be smart and still be deeply stupid about the thing that matters most: people. It's optimized for Rick comfort and Rick power and Rick perpetuation, and it's completely blind to the cost that optimization imposes on the beings it depends on. And here's what I find most interesting about this when you zoom out to the level of the whole theory. Rick C-137, the Rick built this thing, or at least he played a central role in establishing it. We know from later in the series that Rick C-137 is in some sense the original Rick, or at least the most significant Rick in the multiverse. We know that the Central Finite Curve, the structure of the multiverse that the Citadel exists within, is something Rick C-137 had a hand in creating, which means the political and social institution of the Citadel exists within a frame that Rick C-137 designed. In other words, the Citadel is Rick's house. The rules are Rick's rules. The hierarchy is Rick's hierarchy. Even when Rick C-137 is running from the Council of Ricks, even when he loudly declares himself not a joiner, even when he rails against the institution, he is still implicated in what the institution is, because you can't build a universe to your specifications and then pretend to be innocent of what grows in it and what grew in it. One of the things that grew in it is Evil Morty. Let's think about what the Citadel's existence does to Mortys at the psychological level. Not just the Mortys who live there full-time, working factory jobs and cop beats and whatever other labor the Ricks have parceled out to them, but also the Mortys who travel with Ricks, the ones out in the field, the ones who are theoretically the main Mortys, the ones in active Rick-Morty partnerships. These Mortys know about the Citadel. In some sense, every Morty connected to a Rick is connected to the Citadel's system, because the Citadel functions as the institutional backing for the Rick-Morty arrangement. It's the governing body that defines what Ricks and Mortys are to each other. It codifies the relationship, and what it codifies is Rick is the agent, Morty is the accessory. Rick makes the decisions, Morty provides the cover. Rick has the portal gun, Morty holds the Meeseeks box. Now, if you're a Morty of average psychological constitution, if you're a Morty who is sweet and somewhat simple and emotionally driven, which is the default, this arrangement is probably just reality. You might not love it, you might chafe against it privately, but you accept it because you don't really have the framework to challenge it, and also because your Rick probably has some complicated mix of affection and condescension toward you that keeps you uncertain about where you stand. But if you're a Morty who has been pushed past your breaking point, who has been exposed to enough horror, enough exploitation, enough casual evidence that neither the Ricks who use you nor the system that governs you think of you as a full person, something shifts. And what shifts is the foundation, the basic assumption that the Citadel and Rick's behavior has always asked every Morty to make, that this is natural, that this is right, that this is how things are supposed to be. A Morty who stops making that assumption is a Morty the Citadel cannot contain, and a Morty who has also, through whatever combination of experience and native capacity, developed the cognitive tools to act on that rejection. That's something the Citadel has never built a defense against. Because why would it? No Morty is supposed to be able to think that clearly. The whole system is predicated on Mortys not being able to think that clearly, except one of them could, and did, and had been thinking clearly for a very, very long time, sitting in a cell, smiling and waiting. Let's talk about how Mortys end up as disposable. Section 3. Mortys as disposable. There's a running thing the show does that you might have noticed but maybe not consciously cataloged. Across multiple seasons, multiple episodes, in both throwaway gags and land major plot points, the show keeps returning to one idea: that Mortys are replaceable. That when a Morty is damaged or destroyed or worn out, the solution is to get a new one, not to grieve, not to reckon with what happened, just to swap in the next unit and keep moving. This is one of the most disturbing undercurrents of Rick and Morty, and it runs much deeper than most people give it credit for, and it's absolutely central to understanding why Evil Morty exists and what he represents. Let's start with one of the most explicit canonical examples: the existence of the Morty farm in close Rick counters of the Rick kind. We talked about this already, but let's sit with it more carefully. The Morty farm is not a fringe operation. It's not some underground illegal thing that the Council of Ricks is scandalized by. When Rick C-137 is accused of running it, the implication is that the Council would find the specific targeting and murder of Ricks to be the serious crime. The Morty farm itself is presented more as a means to an end, a logistical detail. The farm exists because some Rick or group of Ricks calculated that harvesting Morty brainwaves was more efficient than the traditional arrangement of Rick-Morty partnerships. And nobody in the Council seems particularly horrified by the concept of Mortys being warehoused and used as neurological raw material. The horror in the episode is about Rick being framed, not about what the farm is doing to those Mortys. Think about what that tells you about how the Citadel's institutional culture views Mortys. When the most powerful governing body in the multiverse hears about a warehouse full of Mortys stacked up like batteries, living in simulated realities while their brain activity is harvested, and the primary reaction is not, "This is a humanitarian crisis," but rather, "Who's using this?" That tells you everything about the moral framework this society has built around its Morty population. Mortys are not people in the Citadel's moral accounting, they're resources. Expensive resources with complex properties that need to be managed carefully. But resources, not people. Now, the show also explores the Morty as disposable concept in more intimate, personal ways that don't require the scale of the Citadel to land. And these are actually the examples that hit hardest, because they're not about institutional evil, but about the casual, reflexive diminishment of individual Mortys by the Ricks, who are supposedly their closest companions. Season 1 has an episode that most fans remember primarily for its comedy Meeseeks and Destroy, but that contains a genuinely disturbing subplot that's easy to miss in the chaos of everything else happening. There's a moment early in the episode where Rick and Morty are in a fantasy world and Morty gets sexually assaulted by a giant. The show handles this with characteristic tonal whiplash, jumping between playing it for uncomfortable comedy and letting it land with actual weight. But what's most notable is how quickly the show moves past it. Rick barely registers it. The trauma Morty experiences is real and visible, but the narrative of the adventure keeps going, because adventures don't stop for Morty's internal processing. And by the end of the episode, Morty is still expected to be there, still expected to function, still expected to follow Rick through the portal and back into the next thing. This is a version of the Morty is disposable idea that's not about physical replacement. It's about emotional replaceability. Morty's experience doesn't matter enough to stop the machine. The adventure continues regardless, and Morty's job is to continue with it, to absorb whatever happens to him and remain operational, because his function, his use to Rick, is more important than his interior life. Then there's Morty's Mind Blowers. This is Season 3, Episode 8, and it's one of the clearest and most direct statements the show ever makes about how Rick treats Morty's psychology as something to be managed rather than respected. The premise: Rick has been secretly erasing specific memories from Morty's mind throughout their adventures. Not because those memories are dangerous to Rick, not because it's a practical necessity most of the time, but because Morty's emotional response to certain things is inconvenient. Because Morty getting upset or traumatized or unable to forgive Rick for something Rick did gets in the way of their continued partnership. So Rick fixes it. He opens up Morty's brain, pulls out the offending memory like a splinter, and stores it in a vial in a secret room that Morty doesn't know about. And here's what the episode shows when Morty discovers this room. Many of the removed memories are things Rick did to Morty. Things that were Rick's fault, or Rick's cruelty, or Rick's mistake moments moments that would have broken Morty's trust in Rick permanently if Morty had been allowed to keep them. Rick has been protecting himself and the relationship by deleting Morty's record of being wronged. This is one of the most explicitly abusive things Rick does in the entire series, and the show is aware of that. It presents it as abusive, but it also presents it as something Rick does out of something complicated, not just selfishness, but also possibly a twisted kind of protection. If Morty never has to carry the memory of the worst things, maybe he's better off. That's Rick's likely rationalization anyway. But of course, what it actually does is rob Morty of his own history. It makes Morty's inner life something Rick curates, rather than something Morty owns. A Morty who discovered that this had been happening to him, who found the room, who watched the vials, who understood the scope of what had been taken from him, would have every reason to feel profoundly violated, and every reason to stop trusting Rick's entirely. Every reason to look at the relationship and see it not as partnership, but as ownership. Morty's Mind Blowers is played partly for laughs and partly for genuine discomfort, and it ends in that typically Rick and Morty way where the tragedy is acknowledged and then papered over because they have to get to the couch for the next adventure. But it leaves this residue, this understanding that underneath the fun and the portal hopping and the weird alien adventures, something genuinely troubling is happening to Morty's selfhood. Something is being taken. Let's talk about Season 2, Episode 6, The Ricks Must Be Crazy. This is the episode where Rick has a whole miniature universe inside his car battery. A universe where microscopic intelligent beings live and work, unknowingly providing energy for Rick's car, the Miniverse. And then it turns out the lead scientist in the Miniverse has built his own smaller universe inside his battery for the same reason. Universes within universes, all exploited for power. The episode is a brilliant structural joke, but it's also making a completely explicit point about Rick's relationship to the beings he depends on. He doesn't tell them the truth. He doesn't ask for their participation. He builds them into a system designed to extract value from them without their knowledge or consent. And when they figure it out and try to push back, he considers this a problem to be solved rather than a negotiation to be had. Morty, watching all of this, has a conversation with Rick about the ethics of the situation that Rick dismisses with characteristic bravado. But Morty's discomfort is visible. He can see the parallel. He can see that Rick treats the Miniverse beings the way the Citadel treats Morty's, as power sources, as raw material, as means to an end. He can see the relationship between Rick's cosmological philosophy and the small-scale dynamics of their own partnership. And Rick, of course, doesn't engage with that. Rick is very good at not engaging with the things that would implicate him. Now let's talk about a different kind of Morty disposability, the literal kind. The whirly-dirly conspiracy of Season 3 shows us a scenario where Rick is, for once, not the person in control. But more instructively for our purposes, the B-plot of that episode shows what happens to Mortys when their Ricks are absent or incapacitated. Summer has to essentially become Rick in that episode, making hard calls, putting herself in danger, doing the Rick things that Rick usually does. And it's instructive that she can, to a degree that the Rick role is learnable, performable, adoptable by someone with enough exposure to it. But it also shows what happens to the emotional balance when the Rick anchor is gone. Things get unstable, chaotic, and the Morty equivalent, Morty himself, barely functional, is basically a liability. The show is constantly using these structural moments to tell us something about what Mortys are for, what they're built to do, and what happens when that structure is disrupted. But the most visceral and disturbing example of Mortys as disposable, the one that I think is most directly relevant to understanding Evil Morty's hatred, is the existence of the Morty training grounds on the Citadel, and, relatedly, the practice of Rickless Mortys. In the Citadel, Mortys who no longer have Ricks because their Rick died, or abandoned them, or whatever, become wards of the Citadel. They're housed together, they're trained for reassignment, and they exist in a kind of bureaucratic limbo that is, by any measure, dehumanizing. They're processed, they're categorized, they're assigned numbers and types and suitability ratings. The whole apparatus of the Citadel's management of Mortys treats them as inventory, as entries in a database to be matched with the Ricks who need them. Now imagine being a Morty who knows this, who understands that from the Citadel's perspective, you're not a person, you're a line item, who has seen, maybe, other Mortys go through the reassignment process, who understands that your relationship with your Rick is not a partnership but a deployment, who knows that if your Rick dies or disappears or gets a better offer, you'll be back in the system within days, being evaluated and reassigned like a piece of office furniture. What does that do to a person? For most Mortys, the answer is learned helplessness, a diffuse, low-grade grief. The capacity for hope reduced by repeated exposure to the fact that hope doesn't really have anything to attach to. Mortys in the Citadel, particularly the Rickless ones, often seem diminished in exactly this way. They shuffle, they look down. They answer questions with the flat affect of someone who has been told in 1,000 different ways that their feelings about their own situation are not a relevant input into any decision that affects them. For a Morty with sufficient intelligence and a sufficiently developed sense of self, the answer might be something entirely different. The answer might be fury, cold, patient, focused fury, of the kind that doesn't flare out and burn itself out, but instead settles in and waits for the right moment. There's also the matter of the Roy game in Season 2's Morty Night Run Roy, A Life Well Lived. This is the game at the Alien Arcade where you can live an entire simulated human lifetime. Rick loves this game. He's clearly played it many times. And when Morty plays it, he goes in and lives a whole life, has a family, has struggles, has triumphs, ends up back in the carpet store, and it's moving and strange and melancholy, and then he comes back out and has to go back to being Morty. What this scene does, at a level beneath the comedy, is show us what Morty might want if he could want freely. A life, a real one, not an adventure, not a mission, not a traumatic exposure to the worst corners of the multiverse as somebody else's sidekick, just a life with the full arc of a person, with meaning accumulating naturally through time and experience and relationship. But Morty doesn't get that. Morty gets to play at it for a few minutes in an Alien Arcade, and then Rick pulls him out and they go back to the usual. This is the thing about how the show treats Mortys as disposable that's hardest to articulate but most important to feel. It's not just that Morty's physical safety is compromised, it's that their aspirations are structurally irrelevant. They don't get to want things for themselves, not really, because what they want is never the point. The point is always what Rick wants, what the adventure requires, what the mission needs. A Morty who fully understood this, who had mapped the whole architecture of their own irrelevance, would have two options. They could accept it, which most Mortys do, because acceptance is less painful, or they could reject it, completely and without compromise. Evil Morty chose rejection, and then he built a plan around it. But here's the part that ties back to our theory most directly. All of these examples of Morty disposability, the Morty farm, the mind-blowing, the Citadel's bureaucratic management of Rickless Mortys, the emotional dismissal that runs through every Rick-Morty adventure, none of this happened in a vacuum. This is the world that Rick built, or at least the world that Rick operates within and perpetuates. Rick uses the Morty brainwave camouflage system. Rick erases Morty's memories. Rick takes Morty on adventures that clearly traumatize him and then expects him to keep showing up. Rick participates in the Citadel's logic even while claiming to reject the Citadel. Every example of Morty disposability connects through some chain of causation back to choices Rick has made or systems Rick has perpetuated, which means that when a Morty has been ground through enough of this, when a Morty has been exposed to enough of the casual, systemic, grinding disposability that defines his place in Rick's universe, and when that Morty has also, somehow, developed the cognitive capacity to understand what's happening to him, he doesn't just become angry at abstract injustice. He becomes angry at the specific source of that injustice. He becomes angry at Rick. And that anger, that specific, identified, evidence-based anger, is exactly what we see in Evil Morty's eventual confrontation with the Citadel. He's not just tearing down a system he dislikes, he's burning down a machine that he understands from the inside, having been processed through it, having been both a product and a weapon of it, having lived inside the logic of Morty disposability long enough to be an expert on every single one of its mechanisms. You can't understand Evil Morty's endgame without understanding that he has been on the receiving end of everything in this section. He knows what it is to be treated as replaceable. He knows what it is to be used as a tool. He knows what it is to exist exist inside a system that has decided at the foundational level that his interiority doesn't count. He knows because he lived it. And now, let's talk about how Rick, specifically the relationship with Rick, the experience of spending time with Rick, changes a Morty, because that's the next piece of this. That's where the theory starts to really tighten. Section 4. Rick's influence on Mortys. Here's something the show establishes very early and then keeps returning to in increasingly complex ways. Being around Rick changes you. Being around Rick for a long time changes you profoundly, and not always in ways that are good or comfortable or easy to reverse. The show makes this explicit in several places, but it also makes it implicit in the slow, visible transformation of our Morty, the one we follow from Season 1 through Season 5, from the awkward, sweet, somewhat bumbling kid in the pilot to the teenager who, by Season 3 and beyond, makes cold calculations, understands manipulation, and has absorbed enough of Rick's worldview to be genuinely capable in his own right. Our Morty doesn't become Rick, but he becomes something that didn't exist before Rick, something Rick-adjacent, something shaped by prolonged exposure to the particular pressure of Rick's way of engaging with reality. And if our Morty, who gets to go home at night, who has parents and a sister, who has a school and a social life, however degraded by his Rick-adjacent existence, has been changed this much, what happens to a Morty who has been exposed to Rick even more intensely? What happens to a Morty who got more Rick for longer, with less insulation? Let's start with how Rick teaches. Rick is a teacher in the way that only really arrogant geniuses are teachers, by exposure and consequence, not by instruction and scaffolding. He doesn't explain things to Morty and then wait for Morty to be ready to do them. He throws Morty into situations where Morty has to figure things out or bad things happen, and he trusts that Morty's survival instinct, combined with the situation's pressure, will produce learning. This is pedagogically questionable at best and straight-up abusive at worst, but it does work. In a sense, Morty does learn things. He learns them at a cost, but he learns them. The show gives us a particularly pure version of this in Season 4, Episode 8, the Vat of Acid episode. This is the episode where Morty asks Rick to create a fake checkpoint save mechanism, like a video game save state, so that Morty can take risks without permanent consequences. And Rick does it, but with a cruel twist. It's not actually a save state device. What it does, instead, is kill everyone in the current reality and teleport Morty to an adjacent one where the situation conveniently resolved itself the way it would have if the save had been rolled back. So every time Morty uses it, he's actually destroying a version of his own life and the people in it, and jumping sideways to a version that looks the same, but where the previous Morty died. This is Rick's lesson. You wanted safety from consequences? Here are consequences so massive and permanent that the original consequences seem trivial. You wanted the ability to take risks without losing? Here is what it actually means to avoid losing. It means someone else always pays. Morty doesn't know this is happening when he uses the device. He lives a whole life, falls in love, has a relationship, loses it, grieves, and then uses the device to undo it, not understanding that he's killed the woman he loved in doing so. The emotional weight of this is enormous. And then Rick shows him the truth. Every save killed the people in that reality. Every time you pressed the button, people died so you could get a do-over. This is a lesson, and it's a lesson that Rick clearly intends as such. He's showing Morty, your desire for consequence-free existence has consequences. Your wish to avoid pain causes pain to others. The universe doesn't provide safety without cost. It just redistributes the cost to people you can't see. Now that lesson has actual moral content. It's not wrong, but the method of teaching it is horrifying. Rick let Morty live through grief and loss, and then revealed that all of it had been used as a teaching tool. He instrumentalized Morty's pain. He turned Morty's genuine emotional experience into a lecture. A Morty who absorbed the lesson of this experience wouldn't just learn, don't try to avoid consequences. They'd also learn something else, that the people around them, including Rick, are capable of treating their genuine emotional experiences as raw material for instruction. They'd learn that pain can be engineered. They'd learn that relationships can be instrumentalized. They'd learn that the person with the most power in a dynamic will use that power to teach you things, whether or not you want to be taught, and whether or not they ask your consent first. These are Rick's lessons, and they're damaging even when they're accurate. Season 3, Episode Episode 5, The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy. Rick takes a despondent Jerry on an adventure. This sounds like comedy, and it is, partly, but there's a moment in this episode that's quietly devastating. Rick is drunk and alone on a surreal alien landscape, and he tells Jerry something honest, that he invented going on adventures with his grandkid specifically so he could escape something. That the whole Rick and Morty enterprise is, on some level, a coping mechanism, an escape. This connects to something Rick says elsewhere in the series, that he went back to Beth's family, partly because he needed something to care about, and partly because having Morty specifically serves his functional needs. And the show is clear that this is complicated. Rick's love for his family, including Morty, is real, but it's also entangled with his need, with his self-protection, with his history. It's not a clean love. It's a love that has been through a lot and emerged as something Rick himself can barely look at directly. A Morty who fully understood Rick's motivations, who could see past the performance of affectionate dismissal to the buried truth of why Rick keeps Morty around, would understand something crucial: that Rick needs him, that the dynamic is not as one-directional as it looks, that Morty is not just a passenger in Rick's adventures, but something Rick actually depends on, for reasons Rick would never voluntarily admit. And if you're a Morty who understands that Rick needs you, who understands the specific form and history of that need, you also understand something else. That need is a leverage point, that the most powerful being in the universe has a vulnerability, that the brainwave camouflage explanation for keeping Mortys around is only part of the truth, and the other part of the truth is something much more intimate and exploitable. Most Mortys who understand this would probably feel, I don't know, complicated, sad, a kind of protective love mixed with resentment. Our Morty, when he gets glimpses of Rick's vulnerability, tends to move toward protectiveness, toward wanting to help Rick, toward using the knowledge gently. But a Morty who has been pushed past caring, who has been hurt enough by Rick's to have abandoned the protective instinct, a Morty who looks at that vulnerability and sees only the lever. That's a different kind of Morty entirely. Let's talk about what Rick teaches Mortys about the multiverse. Not in a curriculum sense again. Rick doesn't teach in an organized way, but in an experiential sense. What does a Morty learn by spending years going on Rick's adventures? First, they learn that death is cheap. Not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in a visceral, experienced, first-person sense. They have died, in many cases, or versions of them have died, and the adventure kept going. They've watched people die. They've caused people to die. They've been in situations so dangerous that survival felt like luck rather than design. And then they came home and ate dinner. When death becomes cheap, when your relationship with mortality is this repeatedly fractured, it changes how you think about the value of individual lives, about stakes, about what it means to sacrifice something. A Morty who has experienced enough death starts to develop a kind of calculus around it. Not necessarily a cold one. Our Morty still gets upset about death, still responds emotionally to loss, but the ceiling of what's conceivable as a cost rises significantly. Evil Morty executes his own Citadel advisors. He doesn't flinch about it. He does it with the same affect most people have when they're filling out paperwork. That capacity to treat death as a tool rather than a limit is something that gets developed. Nobody is born with it. It comes from somewhere. Second, Mortys learn that most official narratives are lies. Rick is constantly revealing to Morty that the thing Morty thought was true about the world, about the Galactic Federation, about institutions, about authority figures, is actually a cover story. The universe is not governed by benevolent intelligence. It's governed by competing interests, and the official explanation for any given thing is usually designed to serve those interests. The truth is almost always uglier and more interesting than what you're told. This is Rick's gift to Morty, in a way. He's giving Morty epistemological autonomy, the capacity to question official versions of things. But it's a double-edged gift, because it also produces a deep, habitual distrust of any claim to authority. A Morty who's been through enough Rick adventures doesn't just distrust the Citadel's official ideology, he distrusts ideology itself. He looks at every system and asks, who built this, and what does it do for them? That's exactly the question Evil Morty is asking of the Citadel, and it's exactly the question Rick taught him to ask. Third, Mortys learn to be patient. This one is subtler but actually really important. Adventures with Rick are not a sequence of immediate gratifications. They're chaotic, dangerous, unpredictable, but Morty, to survive them, has to develop the ability to hold on through periods of discomfort and uncertainty and not take the wrong action prematurely. He has to learn to wait. He has to learn that the situation will develop, that the picture will become clearer, and that acting before the picture is clear usually makes things worse. Evil Morty's patience, the way he waited through Season 1's Cell, Season 3's political maneuvering, the slow build-up to Season 5's endgame is extraordinary. He didn't rush. He didn't act until he had what he needed. That's not Morty patience by default. That's Morty patience that's been trained. Now there's one more thing that time with Rick does to a Morty that I want to spend some real time on, because it's the most significant piece of this section. Rick exposes Mortys to Rick's own nihilism. Not by sitting them down and explaining his philosophy again. Rick doesn't do that, but by modeling it, constantly and pervasively. Rick's fundamental orientation toward the universe is one of profound meaninglessness. Nothing matters. All consciousness is temporary. The multiverse is infinite, and therefore any individual action is of infinitely small consequence. Science is real, meaning is fake, love is chemicals, justice is a narrative we tell ourselves, and the only intellectually honest position is to acknowledge all of this and just do whatever you want anyway. Because if nothing matters, then your wants matter as much as any other available motivation. This is Rick's worldview. It's performed. In part, Rick uses nihilism as a defense, as a way to not feel the grief that's underneath it. But it's also genuinely held, in significant part. Rick really does believe that the multiverse is a cold, indifferent, structureless place, and that any attempt to impose meaning on it is self-deception. Now, what does sustained exposure to this worldview do to a Morty? For most Mortys, it probably creates a kind of muffled anxiety, a background sense that the ground under their feet isn't quite solid, that the things they've been told matter might not, that the adults who are supposed to have answers mostly don't. Our Morty gets depressed sometimes, he gets nihilistic sometimes, he has moments of genuine existential despair that the show treats with surprising seriousness for a comedy. But for a Morty who takes the nihilism seriously, who doesn't just absorb it emotionally, but thinks it through rigorously to its conclusions, the landscape that opens up is genuinely radical. If nothing matters because the universe is structureless and meaning is constructed, then the Citadel doesn't matter. The hierarchy of Ricks and Mortys doesn't matter. The Central Finite Curve doesn't matter. The rules of the game are not cosmic truth. They're choices that someone made. And if they're choices, they can be unmade. This is exactly Evil Morty's philosophical position as far as we can read it. He doesn't seem to believe in the Citadel's authority the way most beings believe in institutional authority as something real and grounded in natural order. He seems to look at it the way Rick would look at a government or a religion, as a construction, as a power structure dressed up in language of inevitability, as something that can be exposed as fiction if you're willing to look at it clearly. He has used Rick's nihilism against the system Rick helped build. That's the recursive quality of this theory that I find most fascinating. Rick's philosophy contains the seeds of its own institutional destruction. The way Rick thinks the skepticism, the institutional distrust, the willingness to look past official narratives, the comfort with treating conventional morality as optional, is also the way you'd have to think to decide that the Citadel needs to be burned down. Rick has never fully applied his own intelligence to the question of whether the Citadel is legitimate. Evil Morty has, and the reason Evil Morty can apply that intelligence is because a Rick, probably his Rick, or the succession of Ricks whose influence shaped him, taught him how. One more thing about Rick's influence: love, or the complicated, asymmetric, weaponized, but real version of it that Rick dispenses. Rick loves Morty. The show is clear about this, even through all the layers of performance and denial. In A Wrinkle in Time, he saves Morty at the cost of his own existence, then gets himself back through an act of typically Rickian ingenuity, but not before making a decision that was unambiguously self-sacrificing. In The Rickchurian Morty Date, he caves on his apocalyptic standoff with the US president specifically because Morty asks him to. In countless smaller moments across the series, Rick's genuine care for his grandson leaks through the armor. But the the love is conditional in one very specific way. It requires Morty to keep being Morty, to keep being the sweet, slightly gullible, emotionally available Morty who Rick can carry, protect, dismiss, and occasionally be honest with. Rick loves Morty partially because Morty is not a threat to Rick. Morty confirms Rick's superiority by existing as he is. A Morty who develops past that, who becomes capable of seeing Rick clearly, of matching Rick intellectually, of removing Rick's ability to feel superior, stops fulfilling that function. And a Morty who also, in the process, develops contempt for Rick rather than the complicated love that our Morty maintains that's a Morty Rick's affection can't reach anymore. Evil Morty has moved past the point where Rick's version of love can do anything to him. He's not trying to win Rick's approval. He's not trying to heal the Rick-Morty dynamic. He's done with the dynamic entirely. He looked at what it really is, all the way through, and decided he wanted no part of it. That's an extraordinary act of clarity, and it required being inside the dynamic long enough to understand it completely. Let's talk about what that kind of clarity looks like in practice. Let's talk about Evil Morty's intelligence. Section 5. Evil Morty's intelligence. Okay, so let's just state the obvious and then dig past it. Evil Morty is very smart. That's the surface observation. He's smarter than normal Mortys, smarter in ways that are visible and consequential. He's a good planner, a good manipulator, a good reader of people and systems. He's patient. He's precise. He doesn't make obvious mistakes. When he moves deliberately, and the moves tend to have the quality of having been thought through several steps ahead of where anyone else in the conversation is looking. But smart is such an insufficient description that it's almost misleading, because intelligence in the Rick and Morty universe is not just about raw cognitive processing. Rick is the smartest being in any universe, and look what he does with it. He mostly just survives and drinks and avoids the grief underneath everything. Intelligence without direction is just noise. Evil Morty's intelligence is interesting not because of its quantity, but because of its quality, because of what it's pointed at and how it works. Let's try to characterize it more precisely. The first thing that distinguishes Evil Morty's intelligence is its clarity about systems. He doesn't just understand individual events and relationships. He understands the structures that produce those events and relationships. He understands the Citadel not as a place, but as a mechanism. He understands the Rick-Morty dynamic not as an individual relationship, but as a template that gets replicated across the multiverse with specific, predictable effects. He understands the Central Finite Curve not as a metaphysical curiosity, but as a political tool, as a way of organizing the multiverse to serve specific interests. This is systems-level thinking, and it's actually rare even among Ricks. Most Ricks are individually brilliant, but politically myopic. They're genius at solving specific problems. How do I build this device? How do I get out of this situation? How do I outwit this opponent? But they're not particularly good at stepping back and asking, what is the system that produced this situation? And should I be trying to escape it or trying to change it? Evil Morty is always asking the second question. That's his primary mode of engagement. He doesn't ask, how do I get out of the cell? He asks, what is the cell part of? And how do I dismantle the whole thing? The second thing that distinguishes his intelligence is his emotional neutrality. I want to be careful here because I don't think Evil Morty is emotionless. There are glimpses of something real underneath the surface, and we'll talk about those later in the section on his hatred toward Ricks. But his emotional life doesn't interfere with his cognition in the way that other characters' emotions do. He doesn't make decisions out of anger, even though he presumably has enormous anger. He doesn't make decisions out of fear. He doesn't make decisions based on what would feel satisfying versus what would be strategically correct. Rick, for all his intelligence, makes choices all the time that are emotionally driven. He blows up the Galactic Federation partly because it feels right. He sabotages his own happiness repeatedly because dealing with the vulnerability of love is too scary. He makes enemies when he could make allies because being agreeable feels compromising. Rick's intelligence and Rick's emotional damage are always in negotiation, and the emotional damage wins more often than Rick's self-image allows him to admit. Evil Morty's intelligence doesn't seem to have that particular war going on inside it. He has a goal. He has a plan. He executes the plan without letting his internal life corrupt the execution. This is either because his emotional life has been reduced by damage to a kind of background radiation variation that doesn't interfere with cognition, or because he has achieved a level of self-discipline that is extraordinary, or because, and this is the darkest reading, his goal and his deepest emotional need are so perfectly aligned that there's no tension between what he wants to feel and what he needs to do. That last possibility is interesting. If what Evil Morty most fundamentally wants is out of the system, out of the Central Finite Curve, away from Ricks and Citadels and the whole structure of this particular corner of the multiverse, then achieving his goal is his emotional satisfaction. There's no conflict between the tactical and the personal because the tactical is the personal. The third distinguishing feature of his intelligence is his mastery of information management. Evil Morty knows things other characters don't know, and he knows them because he's figured out how to gather information without revealing himself as the gatherer. In his first appearance, he's spent considerable time learning how to construct and wire a mind control device into a Rick's brain without anyone knowing. In his Season 3 appearance, he runs a political campaign while concealing his true identity so thoroughly that the Citadel's resources, all that Rick-level intelligence applied to security and surveillance, can't figure out who he really is until he's already won. In his Season 5 appearance, he has clearly been accumulating technical knowledge and resources over years of Citadel presidency without tipping his hand. This is spycraft. This is counterintelligence. This is the kind of information security that requires not just intelligence, but discipline and long-horizon thinking. And it suggests that Evil Morty has been operating in a state of sustained caution for a very long time. That his entire public existence has been, in some sense, a cover story for his actual project. This connects to something important about how he learned. You can't learn information security without understanding that you're being watched. You can't learn to conceal your real agenda unless you have a real agenda worth concealing. Evil Morty has been thinking about this, building toward this, probably since long before his first on-screen appearance. The person we see in Season 1, the one in the cell with the smile, is already the finished product of a long internal development. He didn't become this when he got caught. He became this long before, in private, through a process of understanding and decision-making that happened off-screen, in circumstances we can only speculate about. The fourth thing worth noting is his use of Mortiness as camouflage. This is incredibly subtle and incredibly effective. Evil Morty, when he needs to operate in the open, doesn't present as a genius. He presents as a Morty, anxious, slightly awkward, earnest. During the Citadel political campaign in Season 3, he gives speeches that sound like what a well-meaning Morty would say. Passionate, a little clumsy, clearly heartfelt. He reads as authentic precisely because he's deploying the Morty template with perfect accuracy. And this is brilliant in the most uncomfortable way possible, because the Morty template, the sweet, genuine, emotionally accessible Morty that everyone underestimates, is exactly what Ricks are trained to see as non-threatening. Ricks look at Mortys and see no danger. They see auxiliary components. They see brainwave covers and emotional support units. They don't see rivals. They don't see threats. They certainly don't see someone capable of outthinking them. Evil Morty weaponizes that blindness. He uses the Rick's contempt for Mortys as a blind spot, as cover for exactly the activity the Ricks would be trying to detect and prevent if they believed a Morty capable of it. This is, again, recursively Rickian. Rick always uses everyone else's assumptions against them. He weaponizes the fact that people underestimate him, or think they understand him, or assume he's going to behave in a certain way. Evil Morty does the same thing. He just happens to be doing it to the class of beings that includes Rick. Now let's talk about where this intelligence comes from, because he's just smart isn't an answer, even from a fictional logic standpoint. The show has established that Mortys are not supposed to be at this level. The Morty template, the thing that makes a being a Morty in any given universe, produces beings of a certain psychological type and a certain cognitive range. Sweet, anxious, emotionally oriented, not particularly analytical, not particularly strategic. That's the Morty baseline. There are variations, clearly. Our Morty by Season 3 is significantly more capable than he was in Season 1. There are Mortys in the Citadel who've developed specific skills and competences. The template has range, but within that range, the general character is consistent. Mortys are not Ricks. Evil Morty is so far outside that that range that he constitutes a category of one. He's not at the high end of Morty variation, he's somewhere else entirely, and you have to account for that. There are a few possible explanations, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first is that Evil Morty has spent more time with a Rick than most Mortys, and specifically that the Rick he spent time with pushed him harder than most Ricks push their Mortys. We know from the show that prolonged exposure to Rick does something to Morty. Cognitively makes him more capable, more strategically aware, more able to handle complexity. If that process were extended, intensified, or applied to a Morty with some native advantage in intelligence, the result could plausibly exceed normal Morty parameters significantly. The second is that Evil Morty has had his cognitive development altered deliberately, either by a Rick, including possibly himself retroactively if he has access to that technology, or by experiences that pushed his development in atypical directions. The show hints at the possibility that something specific happened to Evil Morty that was outside the normal range of Rick-Morty experiences. His control device in Season 1, the thing wired into his Rick's brain, is technically sophisticated enough that it's hard to imagine most Mortys building it without significant help or a very unusual set of skills. The third, and the one that fits most cleanly with the theory we're building, is that Evil Morty's intelligence is what happens when the specific crucible of the Rick-Morty relationship produces, in a Morty with sufficient baseline capacity, something that the relationship is not designed to produce. Something that Rick's way of interacting with Mortys was supposed to suppress or contain, because a Morty who thinks at this level is a destabilizing presence in a system that depends on Mortys staying subordinate, but that instead got developed. Think about it this way. Rick, by taking Morty on adventures, by exposing him to real danger and real complexity, by treating him with a kind of rough honesty about what the universe actually is, Rick is also creating the conditions under which a sufficiently capable Morty could develop. The sharpening process that makes Morty more capable over seasons of the show is exactly the same process that, applied with more intensity or over a longer period, could produce something beyond our Morty. Evil Morty might be what our Morty would become if the process went further, if the exposure was more extreme, if the kindness was stripped away, if the love that softens Rick's treatment of our Morty wasn't there, and what remained was just the intensity, the pressure, the constant engagement with a brutal and complex universe through the lens of someone who wants you to be better than you are. Or if there was a betrayal profound enough to break the part of Morty that keeps him from taking the knowledge Rick gives him and turning it against Rick. Because that's the other thing to understand about Evil Morty's intelligence. It's not just that he's cognitively capable, it's that he's motivated in a specific direction. Intelligence without motivation produces Rick someone brilliant who mostly uses it to survive and escape. Intelligence with a clear motivation, aimed at a specific target, applied patiently over a long period, that's Evil Morty. And the motivation has a specific emotional root. It's anger. Cold, clean, patient, thoroughly justified anger. Let's talk about where that anger comes from. Section 6. Hatred toward Ricks. There's a moment in Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Morty Jack, that I want to spend a lot of time on, because it might be the most important moment in Evil Morty's entire arc, maybe in the whole show. Evil Morty has just gained access to the Citadel's most secure and most comprehensive data system. He's been working toward this for years through imprisonment, through political maneuvering, through the slow, deliberate accumulation of institutional power. And now he's inside the archive. He can see everything, every Rick, every Morty, every dimension, every interaction that the Citadel has ever cataloged. And what he's specifically looking for, what he drills down to with unmistakable focus, is the record of every Morty who ever had a traumatic experience with a Rick. Every moment a Rick betrayed his Morty, abandoned him, erased him, hurt him, discarded him. Every data point in the system that represents a Morty being broken by the relationship the Citadel presents as natural and inevitable and fine. He stands there looking at these records, and his face is not furious, not exultant, something more complex, something that looks like recognition, like someone who has found the documentation of what he already knew, like someone who has had their private experience finally validated by an official ledger, and then he uses that data to build something. We'll get to what he builds in the next section. section, but what matters right now is what the scene tells us about the nature of his hatred. Evil Morty doesn't hate Ricks the way a simple villain hates things reflexively, emotionally, without intellectual foundation. He hates Ricks the way someone hates a system that has been well understood. He hates the specific thing, identified precisely, with full documentation. His hatred is evidence-based, and it's been building probably his entire life. The question of what exactly happened to Evil Morty, what specific experiences produced this specific level of hatred, is one the show deliberately leaves open. We never get his origin story in explicit form. We get implications and suggestions and evidence, but not a clean narrative. And I actually think that's the right choice, not just dramatically, but thematically, because the absence of a single dramatic origin moment suggests that Evil Morty's hatred isn't the product of one terrible event. It's the product of accumulation, of 1,000 small moments of exploitation and dismissal and instrumental treatment, adding up over years until the weight of them produced something irreversible. That's actually more honest than a dramatic origin story. Real hatred, the kind that sustains a years-long revolutionary project, doesn't usually come from a single moment of trauma. It comes from the slow, grinding recognition that your situation is not going to change, that the pattern repeats, that the system is working exactly as designed, that nobody in power is going to fix this because the people in power are the ones who benefit from it staying broken. What we can infer about Evil Morty's specific experiences with Rick the Rick, or Ricks who shaped him, comes from several pieces of evidence scattered across the series. First, his control of a Rick in Season 1. This isn't something you do to a Rick you respect or a Rick you have a functioning relationship with. This is something you do to a Rick you've decided to treat as a means to an end, to treat exactly as Ricks have always treated Mortys. The choice to wire a device into a Rick's brain and use him as a puppet is a statement. It's a demonstration of having understood the relationship from the outside and then inverted it. It says, I know what I am to you, and now you're going to find out what you are to me. The fact that this is the first thing we see Evil Morty do, not a first step towards something bigger, but a fully realized operation already in progress by the time we meet him, implies that he had already done a lot of thinking before Season 1. He didn't arrive at, I should control a Rick in the moment. That plan was old by the time we see it. Second, the way he looks at the Citadel. In Season 3, during the presidential campaign, Evil Morty visits different parts of the Citadel. The factories, the working-class Morty neighborhoods, the Rick administrative centers, and the look on his face when he's walking through these spaces is not amazement or disgust or even anger. It's the face of someone who has already processed all of this, who is walking through a reality they've understood for years and who is mainly taking measurements. He's figuring out the structural weaknesses. He's assessing the field. That's not the look of someone encountering this for the first time. That's the look of someone who grew up inside this or something like it. Someone for whom the casual brutality of the Citadel's class system is not a shock, but a confirmed hypothesis. Third, his speech during the Season 5 endgame. In Rick Morty Jack, when Evil Morty is finally doing the thing he's been building toward, he speaks about Ricks with a contempt so refined that it has moved past emotion into something like anthropological precision. He talks about what Ricks are, what they do, how they think, why they need Mortys, with the detailed understanding of someone who has been observed from the inside. Not just intellectually categorized Ricks, but known them, spent time with them, been hurt by them. The hatred in that speech, and it is hatred, however cool and analytical its tone, is personal. It's not abstract political opposition. It's not ideological rejection of a system he's read about. It's the hatred of someone who knows exactly what they're talking about because they've lived it. And here's the detail that makes this so significant. The specific target of his contempt isn't all Ricks equally. When he talks about the Central Finite Curve, when he talks about what Rick built and why there's a particular edge to it, he's not just criticizing the Citadel as an institution. He's criticizing the act of building this specific universe for this specific reason. He's criticizing the choice behind the architecture, which points directly at Rick C137, because the Central Finite Curve, as we'll discuss in more detail in the next section, was apparently constructed or significantly shaped by Rick C137, the subset of the infinite multiverse multiverse where Rick is always the smartest being that's not a naturally occurring phenomenon. That's a design choice. That's Rick C137 engineering reality so that he's always on top, always the most powerful, always the genius in a universe that has been curated to confirm his genius. Evil Morty understands this, and he is furious about it in the specific, focused way that people are furious when they realize the limitation on their lives was not natural law, but someone's choice. This is the difference between hating gravity and hating the person who built the room you're trapped in. Hating gravity is pointless because gravity isn't making a choice about you. Hating the architect of the room, the person who specifically, intentionally designed a world where your possibilities are constrained by their preferences, that's hatred with a target. That's hatred that can be acted on. Evil Morty's hatred of Ricks is exactly this kind of hatred. He doesn't hate Ricks because they exist. He hates them because someone chose to build a reality organized around their comfort, and that choice came at the direct expense of every Morty who's ever lived inside it. Let's think about what this kind of hatred feels like from the inside, because I think it's easy to look at Evil Morty and see only the cold exterior and miss the heat underneath it. He's not doing this because he enjoys destruction. He's not doing this because he's sadistic or because he finds chaos entertaining. Every action he takes is purposeful, targeted, minimal in its collateral damage relative to its goals. He doesn't blow up the Citadel randomly. He uses precise technological means to achieve a specific outcome. He's not interested in revenge for its own sake. He's interested in getting out. The hatred is the fuel, not the destination. And the destination, leaving the Central Finite Curve, getting to a place outside Rick's organized reality, being genuinely free for the first time, is the thing underneath the hatred. The hatred is what happens when you want freedom desperately and are very precise about who's standing in the way of it. And when you think about it, when you really try to inhabit that perspective, it's not hard to feel the weight of it. Imagine spending your life in a system that was designed by someone who decided they deserved to be on top, and everything in that system's architecture was built to make sure they stayed there. Not because of malice toward you specifically, but because of self-interest that didn't bother to account for you at all. The harm done to you is incidental, a side effect, a feature the architect never thought about, because why would you think about the side effects on people you've decided don't matter? That's the specific horror of what Rick built. Not that he sat down and decided to hurt Mortys, but that he built something for himself that happened to be a cage for them. And then he never looked back at the cage. Evil Morty looked back. Evil Morty has done nothing but look at the cage since the moment he understood what it was. Now, there's another dimension to his hatred that's worth spending time on, the betrayal dimension. Because for his hatred of Ricks to have this intensity, it probably isn't purely abstract political opposition. At some point, there was probably a Rick that Evil Morty felt something for, trusted, maybe, or depended on, or experienced some version of the complicated love that characterizes Rick-Morty relationships, and that Rick probably did something, betrayed the trust, demonstrated in some concrete and unforgettable way that the exploitation the Citadel's system theorizes about was real. We don't know what happened. The show doesn't tell us. But the emotional signature of Evil Morty's relationship with Ricks, the specific texture of his contempt, the way he talks about the relationship between Ricks and Mortys, has the feel of something personal, something that started with an individual and then got generalized to a class, something that began with one betrayal and then got confirmed by the recognition that the betrayal wasn't personal, it was typical, normal, built into the system. That's one of the most psychologically realistic things about Evil Morty, actually, the progression from "my Rick did this to me" to "Ricks do this to Mortys" to "Ricks do this because they've built a world where they can." That's how radicalization actually works, in real people with real experiences. You start with a personal injury, then you recognize the pattern, then you understand the system that produces the pattern, and then you decide what to do about the system. Evil Morty did the full journey. He arrived at the end of it clear lead and ready. Now let's talk about one more thing in this section, Evil Morty's relationship to other Mortys, because one of the most interesting things about him, and one of the things that separates him from a simple victim seeking justice, is that he doesn't seem to particularly care about Mortys as a group. group. He uses Morty's solidarity as a political tool, as we saw in the presidential campaign. But he doesn't appear to have genuine solidarity with other Mortys. He doesn't free them. He doesn't try to build a Morty liberation movement. When he leaves the Central Finite Curve, he leaves alone. This is complicated, and I don't think it makes him simple or wrong. It might mean that his project was never save Mortys from Ricks, but rather get out. It might mean that he has accepted a fairly dark view of what most Mortys are, beings who have been so thoroughly conditioned by the system that they've internalized their own subordination, who can be temporarily roused by a populist speech, but who will, absent the specific conditions that produced Evil Morty, continue to comply with their own exploitation. Or it might mean something even more uncomfortable, that Evil Morty looks at other Mortys and sees himself as he might have been if certain things had gone differently, and finds it too painful to look at for long. Or maybe, and this is the reading I find most consistent with the character, he simply recognizes that you can't free people who haven't yet understood they're not free. Liberation isn't something you do to people from the outside. It requires an internal process, an awakening, a recognition. He went through that process. Other Mortys might someday go through it too, but his job isn't to manage their journey. His job is to complete his own, and that's what he does in the end. Not neatly, not without collateral damage, not in a way that leaves the world obviously better for the Mortys still inside the system, but definitively and on his own terms, which is more than almost anyone in this universe has ever managed. His hatred is real, and it's justified, and it's been documented in the Citadel's own records, and he uses it to do one of the most remarkable things anyone in this show has ever done. He leaves. Section 7. The Central Finite Curve. Okay, this is the one. This is the piece of the theory that makes everything else click into place, because the Central Finite Curve is the architecture. It's the frame inside which everything else in this show happens. It's the thing Rick built, whether directly or indirectly, intentionally or as a side effect, that explains why the Citadel exists, why Mortys are structured the way they are, and why Evil Morty's escape from it is the most significant act in the entire series. Let's define it carefully, because the concept is introduced quickly in Season 5, Episode 10, and it's easy to miss the full weight of it. In Rick Morty Jack, Evil Morty, after years of Citadel presidency, after careful accumulation of technical resources and knowledge, after accessing the Citadel's deepest archive, achieves what he's been building toward. He opens a portal that leads outside the Central Finite Curve, and before he steps through it, the show stops to explain what the Central Finite Curve is. The multiverse, in Rick and Morty's cosmology, is genuinely infinite. Infinite dimensions, infinite variations of reality, infinite versions of all possible configurations of matter and energy and consciousness. That's the premise. The multiverse has no edges, no limits, no organizing principle. It's just everything that can exist existing simultaneously. Except that there is a subset of the multiverse, a defined, bounded portion that has been carved out and organized. And within that subset, one condition is consistently true. In every universe in the Central Finite Curve, Rick is the smartest being. Every single one. The curve is not a random sample of the multiverse, it's a curated collection of universes in which a specific kind of being, Rick, sits at the top of the intellectual hierarchy. The Citadel exists at the nexus of these universes. The portal guns the Ricks use access universes within the curve. Everything the Ricks do, everything the Citadel governs, everything that the Rick and Morty dynamic plays out within, it's all inside this constructed, bounded, curated portion of reality. The rest of the multiverse, the genuinely infinite part, the part with universes where Rick might not be the smartest, where the Rick hierarchy might not apply, where the rules are different, is on the other side of a barrier that Rick built. Let that sink in. Rick didn't just become the smartest being in his universe. He constructed a version of reality where he was always the smartest being. He cut off the parts of the multiverse that would challenge that and walled them away. Now, the show is somewhat ambiguous about who exactly built the Central Finite Curve and whether it was a deliberate political act or the emergence of something more complex. But the implication, strongly implied by the episode's dialogue and by everything we know about Rick C-137's history and capabilities, capabilities is that C137 had something essential to do with it. He's the Rickest Rick, the original point of divergence, the one whose choices shaped the parameters within which all other Ricks exist. The Central Finite Curve is, in the deepest sense, Rick's architecture, and this is where the theory really becomes something worth taking seriously. Think about what the Central Finite Curve means for Mortys. In a truly infinite multiverse, the concept of Rick is always the smartest doesn't hold. There are universes where Morty is smarter than Rick. There are universes where the Rick-Morty dynamic is inverted, equalized, or simply doesn't exist in the same form. There are infinitely many configurations of reality in which the power relationship between a Morty-type being and a Rick-type being is not what the Citadel says it naturally should be. All of those universes are outside the curve. The Mortys in the Central Finite Curve don't just happen to live in universes where Ricks are smarter. They live in universes that were selected for that property. The curve is a filter. It allows only universes where Rick is dominant to be part of the accessible multiverse. It structurally eliminates from the Rick's experience of reality any evidence that their dominance is contingent rather than inevitable. This is ideological infrastructure at a cosmological scale. The Ricks of the Central Finite Curve don't just believe they're always the smartest, they live in a portion of reality that has been designed to confirm that belief. Their experience of the multiverse is not a representative sample. It's a curated one, filtered through a criterion that guarantees their supremacy. And they don't know this, or don't think about it, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that their position might not be inevitable in the full scope of infinite reality. The Citadel is built on top of this infrastructure. The Citadel's ideology: Ricks are naturally dominant, Mortys are naturally subordinate. This is just the way things are, is not just a political argument. It's been cosmologically engineered to seem true. By keeping Ricks inside the curve, Rick has ensured that all the evidence available to Citadel Ricks confirms the ideology they've built their society around. That is staggering. That is one of the most audacious acts of reality engineering in the entire series, and the show drops it on you in about 30 seconds of dialogue in the final episode of Season 5, and Evil Morty understands all of this. This is what he's been working toward, not just escaping the Citadel, that's a small goal by comparison, escaping the Central Finite Curve, getting to the part of the multiverse that exists outside Rick's curated reality, getting to somewhere that wasn't designed to make Rick's dominance look like natural law. The specific piece of technology Evil Morty uses to achieve this is interesting, and it's built from the Citadel's own resources combined with something essential. He harvests the crystallized Morty memories, the emotional residue of traumatic Morty experiences, concentrated and preserved, and uses them as fuel. The grief of Mortys, the pain of their exploitation, the emotional weight of being treated as disposable for decades, he converts that into energy powerful enough to punch through the boundary of the Central Finite Curve. There's something almost mythological about this image. He's using the suffering of Mortys, the very suffering that the Central Finite Curve's architecture produced, to destroy the architecture that produced it. He's turning the system's waste product into the bomb that blows it open. But I want to stay with the Central Finite Curve itself for a bit longer, because its implications ripple in several directions that are all relevant to our theory. First, the existence of the curve explains why the Rick-Morty dynamic is so consistent across the multiverse. Every pair of Ricks and Mortys in the Citadel, every Rick who uses his Morty as brainwave camouflage, every Rick who treats his Morty as subordinate, every Morty who lives a smaller life than he might in a different universe, is living that dynamic inside a portion of reality that was engineered to make it seem inevitable. The curve ensures that the Ricks Mortys encounter are always the smartest. It ensures that the power differential is always real. It ensures that a Morty who looks around at his universe sees consistent evidence that Ricks are dominant and Mortys are not. Outside the curve, that consistency vanishes. Outside the curve, a Morty might encounter a reality where his native intelligence and emotional capacity are not disadvantages but advantages, where the things Mortys are good at, empathy, connection, emotional attunement, are more useful than raw analytical power, where the Rick-type being is not automatically the the one in charge. Second, the curve explains Rick C137's specific psychology in a new light. Rick presents himself as a nihilist, someone who has accepted that the universe is meaningless and operates accordingly. But the Central Finite Curve is the most profoundly non-nihilistic act imaginable. It's the act of someone who wanted something very specific from reality and engineered reality to provide it. Someone who wanted to be the smartest being in the universe and carved out a subset of reality where that was always true. That's not nihilism, that's ego. That's the act of someone who cares enormously, who cares so much about a specific kind of self-image that they've bent the structure of reality to protect it. And this makes Rick's nihilism a more complicated performance than it's usually read as. He's not someone who has accepted that nothing matters. He's someone who has decided that one specific thing matters, his own supremacy, and built a universe that confirms it, and then wrapped that in the language of not caring, because caring too much about your own supremacy is embarrassing, and the armor of nihilism is more comfortable. Evil Morty sees through this. He says in Season 5 that the Ricks of the Central Finite Curve are obsessed with being the smartest in the room, to the point where they've made the room. And that observation, so precise, so devastating, is the central critique of Rick's entire project, not just of the Citadel, of Rick himself. Third, the Central Finite Curve explains what makes Rick C137 unusual even among Ricks. Throughout the series, we've seen that Rick C137 is considered exceptional even by Citadel standards. He's the Rickest Rick, more Rick than other Ricks, somehow more fully himself. And part of what makes him that is his awareness of what he's inside. Rick C137 knows about the Central Finite Curve in a way that most Ricks probably don't think about. He knows it because he was involved in creating it. He knows the shape of the cage he built. He just lives in it anyway, because the alternative, engaging with an infinite multiverse where he might encounter his equals or his superiors, is apparently worse. Or maybe the alternative involves something else, something to do with why he built the curve in the first place. Because here's a detail that Rick Mirai Jack gives us that connects to Rick's backstory. Rick C137 built or contributed to the Central Finite Curve after losing his Beth and Diane, after being targeted by the Rick who set off the chain of events that defined his life, after deciding that the multiverse, the full, unedited, infinite multiverse, is a place where something as random and terrible as losing everything you love in one afternoon is possible. The curve might not just be about ensuring Rick's supremacy. It might be about creating a bounded, manageable, Rick-controlled portion of reality as a response to the terror of genuinely infinite chaos. If you're Rick C137 and the thing that broke you was the randomness of a targeting event in a universe you didn't control, then creating a universe you do control, one where your intelligence is always the most significant factor, where random external power can't just reach in and destroy everything, might feel like grief management as much as ego. The curve is Rick's attempt to make the universe safe by making it his. And the tragic irony is that in making it his, in curating it so thoroughly, he also made it a trap for every Morty in it. That's the thing Evil Morty is done with. Not just the Citadel, not just the exploitation, but the fundamental premise that Rick's wound entitles him to restructure reality around his recovery at the expense of everyone else who lives in it. Now let's think about what lies outside the curve, from Evil Morty's perspective. He doesn't know what's out there. Nobody in the Central Finite Curve does, because the curve exists partly to prevent anyone from finding out. What Evil Morty knows is that it's genuinely infinite, genuinely unedited, and genuinely free of the organizing principle that Rick imposed on his portion of reality. He knows that out there, the hierarchy isn't given, that the rules aren't fixed, that a Morty-type being might encounter a version of reality where being a Morty doesn't automatically mean being at the bottom of something. He doesn't know it's good. He doesn't know it's better. He just knows it's real in a way that the Central Finite Curve isn't real in the sense of being unmediated by Rick's specific anxieties and preferences. That's what he's going toward. Not paradise, not a guaranteed improvement, just reality as it actually is, without Rick's fingerprints on it. When you think about it from that angle, Evil Morty's escape isn't just political revolution. It's a philosophical statement. It's the assertion that truth, even uncomfortable, dangerous, unorganized truth, is better than a comfortable, organized lie. That knowing what the universe actually is beats living inside a curated version of it forever. That's not an evil argument. That's not even a particularly unusual argument. That's just the truth, stated clearly by someone who has paid an enormous price to understand it. The Central Finite Curve is Rick's greatest achievement and his greatest crime. It's proof of his genius and evidence of his most profound failure. It's the thing that makes the Citadel possible and the thing that makes Evil Morty necessary. And it's the thing that, when Evil Morty destroys it, takes the whole Citadel down with it, because the Citadel was never actually able to exist without it. The Citadel's ideology, Rick's supremacy as natural law, was only defensible inside a portion of reality that had been engineered to make it look true. Once the curve is gone, so is the foundation of everything built on top of it. Let's watch it go. Section 8. Breaking the System. Season 5, Episode 10. Rick, Morty, Jack. The finale. Let's walk through what Evil Morty actually does, blow by blow, decision by decision, because the precision of his execution is itself part of the argument. You don't do this accidentally. You don't fall into this by chance. Every move in this endgame is the result of years of preparation, years of understanding exactly how the system works, years of identifying exactly where the leverage points are. This is the payoff of a plan that started at minimum before Season 1, Episode 10. We find Evil Morty at the start of Rick, Morty, Jack, still serving as the Citadel's president. He's been in power since the Ricklantis mix-up in Season 3, which means he's governed the Citadel for what the show implies is an extended period, long enough to make significant structural changes, long enough to build the technical infrastructure he needs, long enough to position his pieces where he wants them. He's not governing well by conventional standards. The episode makes it clear that under his presidency, the Citadel has become even more authoritarian. Dissidents removed, Ricks who threaten his authority executed, resources directed toward his project rather than the Citadel's general welfare. He's not a reformer. He was never trying to fix the Citadel from the inside. He was using the Citadel's own institutional power to take what he needed from it and then leave. This is a crucial point. Evil Morty did not spend his years as president trying to build a better Citadel. A reformer would have done that. Someone who genuinely cared about the liberation of Mortys from within the system would have done that. Evil Morty was always going to leave, and he organized his presidency around the goal of leaving, not around the goal of making things better for the beings who voted for him. You can call this betrayal of the Mortys who voted for him, and it is, in a narrow sense. But I think the show is making a more complicated point. The Citadel cannot be reformed from within, because the Citadel's foundational premise, Rick supremacy, Morty subordination, justified by the architecture of the Central Finite Curve, is not a policy position that can be adjusted by electing the right president. It's load-bearing ideology. You can't replace it with something better while keeping the building standing. You have to take the building down. Evil Morty knows this. He arrived at this conclusion long before his presidency. His presidency was just the most efficient mechanism for getting close enough to the building's foundations to plant the explosives. So let's talk about what those explosives actually are. The device Evil Morty builds, the thing he uses to break through the boundary of the Central Finite Curve, requires two components that are both, in different ways, damning indictments of the Citadel's regime. The first component is technical, a massive quantity of energy and an advanced understanding of the mathematics of the curve itself. Evil Morty has spent years in control of the Citadel's most powerful scientific resources, and he's redirected them toward this project. He has access to knowledge that even most Ricks don't have. The structural mathematics of the curve, the specific physical properties of its boundary, because he's had access to the Citadel's deepest archives. Archives that contain, among other things, apparently everything the original architects of the curve ever documented. The second component is the crystallized Morty emotion I mentioned earlier, and this is the one I want to spend more time on, because it's the show at its most symbolically precise. In the Citadel's archive, there is a repository of preserved emotional data from Mortys. The specific content of this repository, as we see when Evil Morty accesses it, is the concentrated emotional residue of Mortys who suffered suffered at the hands of Ricks. Every memory of pain, every experience of exploitation, every moment where a Morty looked at his situation clearly and understood what he was and how little it mattered to the people he was supposed to matter to, all of it has been collected, cataloged, and preserved as data, as research material, as proof that the system the Ricks built has done exactly what it's done to the beings it was done to. And Evil Morty takes this material, this crystallized evidence of the system's crimes, and uses it as the fuel source for the device that destroys the system. This is extraordinary storytelling. It's the show making a point that goes all the way down. The Citadel documented its own crimes, archived its own cruelty, and Evil Morty uses the archive against them. The energy needed to punch through the Central Finite Curve comes from Morty suffering. Morty suffering that the Citadel caused. The system is destroyed by the very thing it produced. There's something almost alchemical about this. The most worthless thing in the Citadel's moral accounting, the pain of Morty's, turns out to be the most powerful thing in the universe, at least for this specific purpose. The thing they discarded becomes the weapon that destroys them. Now let's watch the destruction itself. The battle that occurs in Rick Morty Jack is chaotic and large-scale. It's the season finale after all, and the show goes big. Rick C-137 is pursuing his own parallel story about his back history, which we'll discuss in the next section. The Citadel is in upheaval, with various Ricks and Mortys caught in the chaos of whatever Evil Morty has set in motion. And then Evil Morty activates the device, and he opens a portal that is unlike any portal we've seen before. Not the familiar green, not something that accesses a known dimension. This one is orange, searing, and it opens into something that genuinely looks like the rest of the multiverse, the infinite part, the part outside the curve. And as the portal opens, the Central Finite Curve begins to destabilize. The boundary between the curated portion of reality and the genuine infinite multiverse begins to collapse. The Citadel, which exists at the nexus of the curve, which depends on the curve's architecture for its position and its access to portal technology, begins to disintegrate as the structure it depends on falls apart. The Ricks and Mortys on the Citadel die, many of them, maybe most of them. This is a massive loss of life, and the show doesn't fully ignore that there's horror in the visual of the Citadel coming apart, of beings falling into dimensional rifts. Evil Morty has done this knowing what it would cost, and he does it anyway. And then he steps through his portal and he's gone. The show holds on him for a moment just before the portal closes, standing in the orange light of the space between dimensions, for the first time in his life in a place that isn't inside Rick's architecture, a place that is genuinely his, not given to him, not assigned to him, not part of a system designed to keep him subordinate, his. And we don't know what's on the other side. The show doesn't tell us. The portal closes, and Evil Morty is gone, and we're left with the wreckage of the Citadel and the slowly stabilizing chaos of the collapsed curve, and the question that hangs over everything: was this right? That question is intentional. The show is not endorsing what Evil Morty does. Not entirely. It's not saying, yes, burning it all down was absolutely the right call and here are your heroes. It's saying, here is a person who made this choice, for these reasons, with this understanding of the situation. Here is what it cost. Here is what it produced. Now you figure out what you think about it. But within the context of the theory we're building, the theory that Rick created the conditions that produced Evil Morty, the destruction of the Citadel and the breaking of the Central Finite Curve is the most significant possible evidence of our central point. Because the thing Evil Morty destroys is the thing Rick built. Not in a cartoon villain sense where Rick built a death machine and Evil Morty blew it up, but in the deeper, more troubling sense, Rick built a curated portion of reality organized around his supremacy, and Evil Morty saw it for what it was and rejected it utterly and completely. The scale of the rejection, the willingness to take the entire Citadel down, to break the curve itself, to destroy everything Rick built in this corner of reality, is proportional to the scope of what was being rejected. Evil Morty's answer to the Central Finite Curve is not a complaint. It's not a policy paper. It's not a vote for a different system. It's the total dismantling of the architecture, because the architecture was the problem, and nothing built on top top of it could be anything other than a continuation of the problem. Let's also think about what Evil Morty's escape does to the concept of the Rick-Morty dynamic itself. The dynamic has always been predicated on the idea that a Morty is most useful, most himself, most fulfilled, even in relation to a Rick. That's the ideology of the Citadel, but it's also, in a subtler way, the ideology of the show itself. Rick and Morty, the partnership, the relationship that defines both of them. Evil Morty rejects this, not partially, completely. He doesn't find a better Rick. He doesn't build a healthier version of the dynamic. He leaves the dynamic entirely. He exits not just the Citadel, but the portion of reality in which the dynamic is enforced as natural law. He goes somewhere where the categories Rick and Morty and the specific power relationship between them are not given, where he is just a being in an infinite multiverse without a Rick. That's the most radical possible version of the self-determination argument, and it required everything: the intelligence, the patience, the cold, clear hatred, the years of preparation, the willingness to pay the enormous cost to accomplish. Is he safe out there? Is he okay? Is he genuinely free? Or has he traded one set of constraints for another? We don't know. The show doesn't tell us, but he's somewhere without Rick's fingerprints on it. And for someone who has spent his entire life inside Rick's architecture, that might be exactly enough. Let's now connect all of this back to Rick, to the specific question of causation that is the heart of this whole video. Section 9. Did Rick indirectly create him? We've spent 8 sections building this case. We've looked at Evil Morty's first appearance and what it tells us about his character. We've mapped the Citadel's structure and its ideology. We've cataloged the way Mortys are treated as disposable. We've traced how time with Rick changes Mortys psychologically. We've analyzed what makes Evil Morty's intelligence distinctive. We've examined the roots and texture of his hatred. We've explained the Central Finite Curve and what it means. And we've watched him execute the destruction of everything Rick built in this corner of the multiverse. Now let's put it all together. Did Rick create Evil Morty? The obvious answer, the one the show would probably have a character like Rick himself give in a defensive, deflecting way, is no. Evil Morty is his own person. He made his own choices. He did what he did because of who he is, not because of anything Rick caused. Free will exists, Rick would argue, probably sarcastically, and therefore the choices Evil Morty made are on Evil Morty. This is not the wrong answer. It's part of the truth, but it's also exactly the kind of answer that Rick's particular combination of intelligence and self-protection generates. It's the answer that lets Rick off the hook by reducing the question to individual agency and ignoring systemic causation. It's the argument Rick would make because Rick is very smart and very good at making arguments that happen to arrive at conclusions that don't require Rick to be accountable for things. The more careful, more honest, more fully honest answer is yes. Not entirely, not exclusively, not in a way that eliminates Evil Morty's own responsibility for his choices, but yes, substantially, causally, in ways that the evidence compels us to acknowledge Rick created the conditions that produced Evil Morty. And those conditions are so specific, so clearly traceable, so directly linked to Rick's decisions and Rick's constructions that saying Rick had nothing to do with this requires you to ignore most of what we've established over the previous 8 sections. Let's build the specific causal argument. Step 1. Rick built or substantially shaped the Central Finite Curve. This is established in Rick Morty Jack. The curve is the curated portion of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest. This is not a naturally occurring property of the multiverse, it's an engineering decision. Rick made this decision for reasons that connect to his history: the loss of his Beth and Diane, the need for control after that loss, the desire for a universe organized around his abilities. The decision was made for Rick's benefit. The cost of the decision, the constraint it places on every Morty who lives inside the curve, the way it ensures the Rick-Morty power differential is structural rather than contingent, was apparently not a primary consideration. This is step 1 in the causal chain. Rick built the cage. Step 2. Rick participated participated in establishing and perpetuating the Citadel. Whether he was directly involved in its founding or simply operated within its structure and thereby reinforced it, Rick C-137 is the Rick against whom all other Ricks are in some sense measured. His choices, including his choice to use Morty as a partner, to use the brainwave camouflage system, to participate in the economy of Rick-Morty relationships, contributed to the normalization of the system. When the Rickest Rick does something, it validates that thing as proper Rick behavior. Rick's way of relating to Morty, which is complicated and affectionate, but also exploitative and dismissive, is the template the Citadel's ideology is built around. This is step 2. Rick populated the cage with a structure that justified keeping Mortys in it. Step 3. Rick's method of engaging with Morty, the adventures, the exposure to danger, the rough honesty about the universe, the psychological pressure, the mind-blowing, the erasure of inconvenient memories, is the specific process that, applied intensively enough, produces the cognitive and emotional transformation we see in Evil Morty. It's not one thing Rick does, it's the whole package. It's the full experience of being a Morty in a Rick-Morty partnership, concentrated and extended beyond what most Mortys experience. You can see this process working on our Morty in real time. From Season 1 to Season 5, Morty becomes more capable, more strategic, more clear-eyed about the universe and about Rick. The process works. It works on our Morty in a relatively contained way because our Morty has insulation family, school, the genuine affection that runs through Rick's treatment of him even when it's tangled up with manipulation. He becomes more capable without becoming evil because the love in the relationship is real enough to offset the damage. Now imagine the same process without the insulation, without the affection, with the manipulation and the exposure and the psychological pressure and the rough honesty, but without the genuine care that cushions the impact. Imagine a Rick who taught Morty everything Rick teaches, but who also at some point made clear that the teaching was always instrumental, that Morty's development as a person was always a side effect, not a purpose, that the relationship was always ultimately about the Rick. What you get is a Morty who has absorbed all of Rick's lessons and none of Rick's love. And a Morty who has absorbed all of Rick's lessons without the moderating effect of Rick's genuine care is a Morty who is not constrained by the relationship in any direction. A Morty who is free in the most frightening possible way to take what he's learned and point it wherever he decides it should go. This is step 3. Rick's method of engaging with Morty is the specific process that can produce, under the right conditions, someone capable of being evil Morty. Step 4. Rick's philosophy, the nihilism, the institutional distrust, the willingness to see past official narratives to underlying power dynamics is exactly the intellectual framework a Morty would need to recognize the Central Finite Curve for what it is and decide to destroy it. Evil Morty didn't develop his critique of Rick's architecture from nowhere. He developed it from the same place our Morty developed his growing awareness of how things actually work, from exposure to a Rick who never maintained comfortable fictions about the universe and its power structures. Rick taught Evil Morty how to see the Citadel clearly. Rick's epistemology, question everything, trust no official version, follow the power, is the tool Evil Morty used to analyze the system and determine it needed to be destroyed. This is step 4. Rick's way of thinking at the world is the specific analytical toolkit Evil Morty uses to condemn Rick's constructions. Now, at this point in the argument, someone is going to raise an objection. The objection is, okay, but these are general conditions. They explain why any Morty exposed to enough Rickness might develop in unusual directions. They don't specifically explain Evil Morty as an individual. They don't pinpoint what specific experiences made this specific Morty this specific way. And that's fair. The theory doesn't claim to provide a deterministic origin story, Rick did X, and therefore this specific Morty became Evil Morty. What it claims is more subtle and more honest. Rick built a system and a dynamic that creates the possibility of Evil Morty. That given enough Mortys, enough variations in experience, enough range in how the Rick-Morty relationship plays out, the system will eventually produce someone like Evil Morty. Maybe not often, maybe rarely, but inevitably if the system runs long enough, because systems that generate suffering also eventually eventually, generate people who understand the suffering and refuse to accept it. That's not a special property of Rick's system. It's a general property of oppressive systems. But Rick's system has a specific additional feature. It also, simultaneously, provides the cognitive tools to understand and analyze the oppression with extraordinary sophistication. Rick's way of engaging with Mortys makes them smarter and more aware. And a Morty who is smarter and more aware has better tools for understanding their own situation, including the situation of being a Morty in Rick's universe. The system generates both the grievance and the intellectual apparatus to articulate it. Rick's world produces the conditions for Evil Morty and also the cognitive resources he uses to act on them. That's not a coincidence. That's the specific, pointed irony of the theory. Now, let's talk about the most uncomfortable implication, the one that I think the show is actually pointing toward in its quieter moments, even if it never says it directly. Rick C137 specifically might have a more personal connection to Evil Morty's origin than the systemic argument alone would suggest. Here's why. We know from the show that Rick C137 is unusual, is the most significant Rick, the original point of divergence, the one whose choices ripple across all other Ricks. We know that he lost his Beth and Diane before the events of the series, and that this loss was caused by a Rick from another dimension. We know that after this loss, he went through something, a period of grief and rage and transformation that eventually produced the Rick we see in the show and contributed to the creation of the Central Finite Curve. What the show suggests, without confirming, is that Rick C137 may have had a specific Morty at some point during this formative period, before the current narrative, before the events of Season 1. In the gaps of his history that the show gestures toward but never fully fills in. And here's the connection. If Rick C137 had a Morty during the period when he was at his most broken, when the grief and rage of losing Beth and Diane was shaping his philosophy and his actions, and his willingness to do things like build the Central Finite Curve, then that Morty was exposed to the most concentrated and most extreme version of Rick's particular kind of damage. The full force of Rick's intelligence, plus the full force of Rick's grief, plus the full force of Rick's willingness to restructure reality for his own purposes, all of that aimed at a single Morty, in a relationship that was probably not at its most careful or most loving. What would happen to a Morty who was that Rick's Morty during that period? The show never answers this directly, but Evil Morty, with his precision, his hatred, his intimate understanding of Rick's psychology, his specific targeting of Rick's constructions, behaves exactly like someone who was that Morty. Someone who was in the room when the worst of Rick was happening. Someone who saw Rick's grief converted into imperial architecture and found it not tragic but unacceptable. This is the most speculative part of the theory, and it should be labeled as such. The show doesn't confirm it, but it doesn't deny it either, and the emotional logic of it, the way it would explain the specific quality of Evil Morty's hatred, the way it would explain his intimate knowledge of Rick's motivations, the way it would explain the targeted, precise nature of his attack on everything Rick built, is compelling enough that it's worth sitting with. If Evil Morty is Rick C137's Morty, or was at some point, then the theory becomes something simpler and more devastating than a systemic argument. It becomes a direct line of causation. Rick, at his most damaged, had a Morty. And what Rick did during that period, including the construction of the Central Finite Curve, broke that Morty in exactly the right way to produce exactly this result. Rick's grief became Rick's architecture. Rick's architecture became Evil Morty's cage, and Evil Morty's response to the cage became the destruction of everything Rick built. The stone Rick dropped into the water eventually came back as a wave. Let me add one more layer to this because I think it's the most emotionally resonant piece of the whole argument. Rick, in the course of the series, clearly understands something about Evil Morty. He recognizes something when they appear in the same episode. The show doesn't give us an explicit dialogue about it, doesn't have Rick sit down and say, "Yes, I know who this is, and here's our history." But there's a quality to how the show frames their awareness of each other that suggests recognition, that suggests the relationship between them is not one between total strangers. And Rick's response to Evil Morty's actions, which includes the destruction of the Citadel and the escape from the Central Finite finite curve is notably not anger or pursuit, or the kind of reactive vengeance Rick brings to things that cross him personally. He doesn't chase Evil Morty. He doesn't try to stop him. Not ultimately. He lets him go. Why? Maybe because he understands. Maybe because Rick, who is smart enough to see what the Central Finite Curve is and to feel some guilt about what it is, also understands why someone would want to break it. Maybe because he recognizes, in Evil Morty's choices, the logic of someone who has processed the same information Rick has and arrived at a more honest conclusion about what it demands. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that I find most haunting, because he knows that he made this, that whatever Evil Morty is, whatever he became, Rick was part of the process that made him. And watching the consequences of that unfold, Rick can't quite bring himself to fight it the way he'd fight an external enemy. Because it's not an external enemy. It's something internal to Rick's own history, ricocheting through reality with its own momentum, doing the thing that Rick's own intelligence and Rick's own philosophy would arrive at if Rick were willing to be as honest as Evil Morty is. Evil Morty is Rick's logic without Rick's emotional breaks, Rick's intelligence without Rick's grief obscuring it, Rick's institutional distrust without Rick's complicated love for his family giving him reasons to stay. Evil Morty is what Rick would be if he hadn't found his way back to the Smiths, and that, when you think about it, might be the most unsettling implication of all. Section 10. Final Reflection. So, here we are. We've gone a long way together. We started with a smile in a prison cell, that small, knowing smile from a Morty who got caught and didn't seem to mind, and we've worked through every piece of the architecture that surrounds that moment. The Citadel and its ideology, the disposability of Mortys written into the system's design, the specific psychological transformation that time with Rick does to a Morty, the extraordinary intelligence that Evil Morty brings to his project, the hatred underneath all of it, documented and evidence-based and pointed precisely at the right target. The Central Finite Curve, Rick's greatest act of reality engineering and his most revealing moment of self-exposure. The destruction of the Citadel and the escape from the curve. The question of causation. And now we've arrived at the place where all these threads come together. And I want to sit here for a while instead of rushing to a tidy conclusion. Because the best thing about this theory, the thing that makes it worth all those words, is that it doesn't resolve cleanly. It doesn't give you a satisfying answer with a bow on it. It gives you a complicated truth that sits uncomfortably and makes you think about the show differently than you did before. Let me start with the question the section header asks. Was Evil Morty born evil, or was he created by Rick's world? The show deliberately refuses to answer this in any direct way. We never get his childhood, his first memories, his relationship with his original Rick, the specific events that shaped him. We get the finished product, sophisticated, patient, cold, purposeful, and we're asked to reverse engineer the origin from the evidence of what he became. And I think the lack of an explicit origin story is actually the show's most honest choice about this character. Because the implicit argument the show is making through everything we've analyzed, through the careful way it constructs the Citadel, documents Morty's suffering, reveals the Central Finite Curve, is that the question of individual origin is less important than the question of systemic production. The question isn't what specific things happened to this specific Morty. The question is, what kind of world produces beings like this, and who built that world? That's a bigger question. It's a scarier question, and it's the question that Rick, if he were truly applying his intelligence without self-protection, would be asking about himself every day. Did Rick build a world that produces evil Mortys? Yes, that's what the evidence shows. Not inevitably, not deterministically, not in a one-to-one relationship where every Morty who spends enough time with a Rick eventually becomes evil Morty. But the world Rick built contains all the ingredients: the hierarchy, the exploitation, the systematic documentation of Morty's suffering, the cognitive tools that come from Rick's way of engaging with reality, the Central Finite Curve as an ideological cage. Put those ingredients together in the right proportions, in the presence of a Morty with sufficient native capacity and sufficient exposure, and you get something that the world wasn't designed to produce, but couldn't help producing. Systems produce their own contradictions. This is true in political theory, in physics, in storytelling. The Central Finite Curve Curve was designed to ensure Rick's supremacy, to make Rick's genius always the most significant factor in any universe. But to ensure that supremacy, it also needed Mortys. And to have Mortys, it needed the specific dynamic that comes with Rick-Morty partnerships. And that dynamic, taken to its logical extreme, applied with maximum intensity, produces the one kind of being who can actually threaten Rick's supremacy from within the system. A Morty who thinks like a Rick but isn't constrained by being one. Rick's need for Morty produced the thing that could end Rick's era. There's something almost Shakespearean about this, the architect done in by the architecture, the intelligence that creates the conditions for its own undoing. Except it's not tragedy in the traditional sense, because Evil Morty isn't a tragic figure. He's not undone. He escapes. He achieves exactly what he set out to achieve. The tragedy, if there is one, is Rick's, or rather, it's the tragedy of the system Rick built, and all the Mortys who were consumed by it before Evil Morty finally broke it. Now let me talk about what this theory changes in how you watch the show. If you accept, even tentatively, as a lens rather than a certainty that Rick created the conditions for Evil Morty, then every moment of Rick's treatment of our Morty carries additional weight. Every time Rick erases a memory, you're watching him potentially create another shard of the specific kind of psychological damage that produces Evil Morty. Every time the show casually depicts Morty being hurt by an adventure and then expected to keep going, you're watching the system running as designed. Every time Rick's intelligence is used to solve a problem and Morty's emotional response to that problem is treated as an obstacle to the solution, you're watching the dynamic that, at scale, produces exactly the kind of resentment Evil Morty has refined to a weapon. It doesn't make Rick a villain. The show is careful about this. Rick's love for his family is genuine, his flaws are understandable, his damage is sympathetic even when it's destructive. But it makes Rick's relationship with Morty morally complicated in a way that you might not have fully felt before you understood what that relationship can produce. Our Morty is, in some sense, lucky. He has parents, he has a sister he loves, he has a school, however terrible, he has a life outside the Rick-Morty dynamic that gives him anchoring and insulation. The love that Rick has for him, however tangled, is real and moderating. Our Morty gets hurt repeatedly and sometimes severely, but he hasn't been broken in the way Evil Morty seems to have been broken. He retains something, some core warmth, some capacity for connection, some fundamental hope that keeps him from arriving at Evil Morty's cold conclusions. But the show keeps giving us glimpses of how close our Morty is to a different outcome. The Vat of Acid episode shows us a Morty capable of cruelty when he's given unchecked power and an absence of consequences. The Season 3 episodes show us a Morty who can make cold, tactical decisions when he has to. The Rickchurian Morty date shows us a Morty who can say, "I'm done," to Rick, who can consider withdrawing from the relationship entirely. These moments are always pulled back from by something, by love, by family, by the fundamental warmth that defines our Morty's character. But they're there, they're possible. The potential is in the template. Evil Morty is what that potential looks like without the pullback, without the warmth, without the love that drags our Morty back from the edge. Let me also reflect on what Evil Morty's escape means for the show going forward. Not in a plot prediction sense, because the show hasn't told us, and I won't speculate there, but in a thematic sense. His escape from the Central Finite Curve is an event that changes the terms of the show's universe permanently. The curve has been broken. The Citadel is destroyed. The institutional structure that organized Rick's portion of the multiverse for however long it existed is gone. The portion of the multiverse that Rick curated to ensure his supremacy has been cracked open. That's not a small thing. That's the end of an era. The universe Rick built, or the universe that was built in Rick's image, is over. Whatever comes next, it comes in a multiverse that is at least partially more honest about what it is than the Central Finite Curve allowed it to be. And the agent of that change was a Morty that Rick's world produced. There's a lesson in this that the show doesn't state, but that hangs over everything. It's about the relationship between power and the conditions it creates, about how the most powerful beings in any system are also inevitably generating the forces that will challenge them, about how intelligence, when it's used to suppress rather than to elevate, cultivate eventually produces in the suppressed exactly the kind of intelligence that the suppression was designed to prevent. Rick wanted to be the smartest being in the room. He made the room. But by making the room, and by filling the room with Mortys, and by bringing Mortys into the intensity of his own intelligence through the Rick-Morty dynamic, he guaranteed that eventually someone would build a better room breaker than the room could contain. And here's the final thought, the one I want to leave you with, because it's the one that feels most true when you sit with this theory quietly. Evil Morty is not Rick's mistake in the sense of an error. He's not a thing that went wrong because Rick miscalculated. He's the correct output of Rick's system, the honest result of the dynamics Rick set up, the logical conclusion of the philosophy Rick embedded in his corner of the multiverse. He's the universe's response to a structure built around one being's need to be supreme. The universe always answers those structures eventually, always. You can be as smart as Rick, as capable as Rick, as good at engineering reality as Rick, and the universe will still, eventually, generate the answer to what you've built. Not because the universe is just, or because there are cosmic forces of balance maintaining equity across reality, but because the universe is genuinely infinite, and an infinite universe is patient enough to produce any response, however rare. Rick built a portion of reality to be safe for himself. He made it bounded, curated, controlled, and within that bounded space, he managed to produce the one Morty who could burn it down. Was Evil Morty born evil? I don't think the question means what it seems to mean. The question assumes that evil is a property someone has at birth, a fixed quality that was always in them, waiting. And Evil Morty might have started with certain capacities, certain native gifts, a certain baseline that was unusual for a Morty. But capacities and gifts don't produce anything by themselves. They have to be developed. They have to be pointed at something. They have to be given a target and a motivation and a framework. Rick's world gave Evil Morty all of that. The target was the Citadel and the Central Finite Curve. The motivation was the specific, documented, fully justified anger of someone who has been treated as disposable by a system designed to dispose of him. The framework was Rick's own epistemology, the intellectual toolkit Rick gave every Morty who spent enough time with him, whether he intended to or not. Evil Morty was created by Rick's world, the way that calluses are created by friction. Not because someone designed the callus, not because anyone intended for it to form, but because that's what happens when tender skin meets sufficient friction over sufficient time. Something harder forms where the softness was. The Central Finite Curve generated its own destruction. Rick's intelligence generated its own opposition. Rick's treatment of Mortys generated the one Morty who could see through all of it. And that Morty stepped through an orange portal into genuinely infinite space, and the door closed behind him. And somewhere in the genuine multiverse, in the part that Rick never curated, the part that exists beyond the choices of any single being, however genius he's out there, free for the first time. And if you were Evil Morty, with all of that behind you, the exploitation, the cold years of planning, the immense cost of what you had to do to get out, and you were standing in genuinely infinite space for the first time in your life, with no Rick above you, and no Citadel around you, and no curve caging the horizon, what would you feel? I think you'd feel something you'd never felt before, something you might not have had a name for, because everything in the world you came from was designed to make it unavailable to you. You'd feel free, not happy necessarily, not safe necessarily, certainly not done with grief, or done with anger, or done with the weight of everything that happened inside the curve, but free, genuinely, structurally, architecturally free. Standing in a portion of reality where no one decided what you are, where the space is real instead of curated, where the question of who you are and what you're worth is actually open. That's what Evil Morty bought with everything he spent. Whether it was worth it, whether the cost to all those other beings was justified by his freedom, is a question I'm not going to answer for you, because the show doesn't answer it either, and I think that's right. These are genuinely hard questions. The ethics of revolution, of systems, of individual freedom versus collective harm. These are questions that thoughtful people have argued about for all of human history, and Rick and Morty isn't naive enough to pretend they have easy answers. What the show gives you instead is the argument, fully realized, carefully constructed, building over 5 seasons to this moment. Here is the system. Here is what it does to the beings inside it. Here is the being it produced who understood it most clearly. Here is what he did with that understanding. Now you decide what you think. And maybe if you're sitting with this late at night, in that particular headspace where a TV show starts to feel like it's actually saying something about the real world, maybe you also sit with the question the theory is really asking. Not, is Evil Morty evil? Not even, did Rick create him? But rather, what systems are you inside of that feel like natural law? What hierarchies have been presented to you as inevitable that are actually choices someone made? And who benefits from those choices? And who pays the cost? Rick built the Central Finite Curve because he needed a universe organized around his safety. He told himself maybe that it was just the way things were. The smart are on top. That's reality. That's just physics. But it wasn't physics. It was a decision, and decisions can be unmade. Evil Morty unmade one, and somewhere out there, past the orange portal, in the infinite, genuine multiverse beyond the curve, he's still going.